Every dollar, the old man said quietly. Every dollar is still there. The voice on the other end of the line went completely silent. Jackson Grizzly Morgan, the man who had made hardened criminals look away, when he walked into a room, stood in his clubhouse holding his phone so tight his knuckles went pale. Because in 40 years of riding and running the most feared motorcycle club in Arizona, nobody had ever said those words to him. Nobody had ever returned a single dollar that didn't have to be. And this wasn't a powerful man calling. This was a 72-year-old retired mechanic from a dying desert town who could barely keep his lights on. Before we go any further, if stories like this move you, please subscribe to our channel and follow along all the way to the end. Drop a comment right now and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's get back to Ethan Carter and the morning that changed everything. The sun had barely cracked the horizon over the Flagstaff Desert when Ethan Carter pulled his truck off the highway shoulder and cut the engine. He sat there for a moment before climbing out the way he always did, not because he needed to rest, but because these quiet seconds before the day's work started were the only time the silence felt like company rather than punishment. 3 years since Margaret died, and the mornings were still the hardest part. The world woke up every day like nothing had changed, and Ethan had to remind himself every single morning to do the same. He grabbed his canvas bag from the passenger seat and stepped out onto the cracked asphalt. The air was already dry and warm, the kind of Arizona morning that promised a brutal afternoon. Ethan didn't mind the heat anymore. He didn't mind much of anything anymore, in the way that a man stops minding things when the list of things he still cares about has gotten very short. He walked the stretch of highway he'd mapped in his head over months of early mornings. The abandoned gas station about a quarter-mile up the road had become his most reliable spot. People broke down near it, threw things out of frustration, left scraps behind when they moved on. Ethan had found copper wire there, twice a decent car battery once, and enough aluminum cans on a good day to put $15 or $20 in his pocket. It wasn't dignity exactly, but it was independence. And at 72, with a pension that ran out before the month did, independence was about the only luxury he had left. He was scanning the weeds along the chain-link fence when his boot caught something soft. He looked down. A wallet. Black leather, thick, worn at the corners in the way expensive things wear when they're actually used every day rather than shown off. Not the slim card holder type that younger men carried. This was the old kind, the serious kind, attached to a heavy silver chain that had come unclipped from wherever it was supposed to be secured. Ethan crouched down slowly. His knees complained the way they always did now, and picked it up. He held it for a moment without opening it. Just held it. Because even at 72, even when life had stripped away most of its softness, Ethan Carter still understood that a wallet lying in the dirt beside an empty highway wasn't just an object. It was someone's disaster. It was someone somewhere who had already noticed the absence and was feeling the particular panic that came with losing the thing that held your cards, your cash, your identification, the small leather-bound proof that you existed in the systems that ran the world. He opened it. The cash hit him first. He didn't count it then, not right away, but even fanned loosely the way it was, he could see it was serious money, hundreds stacked behind 50s. The kind of cash Ethan hadn't held in years, maybe a decade. The kind of cash that spread across the kitchen table back at his house would solve every problem currently sitting on that table in the form of envelopes he'd stopped opening because the news inside them never changed. His hands didn't shake. He was proud of that later looking back. His hands stayed steady. He let his eyes move past the cash. The cards came next, a Visa, a bank card, some kind of membership card with a logo he didn't recognize at first, and a driver's license behind a scratched plastic window. He tilted it toward the early light. Jackson R. Morgan. The address was a Flagstaff P.O. box. The photograph on the license showed a man with a gray beard and eyes that looked like they'd seen more than most people would want to. Age 58. Then Ethan found the photograph. It wasn't in a sleeve or behind plastic. It was just tucked in there loose, the way you'd keep something you pulled out and looked at often enough that protecting it behind a layer of plastic started to feel like putting a wall between yourself and it. A young woman, blonde, maybe mid-20s in the picture, sitting sideways on a motorcycle with her head thrown back in a full, unguarded laugh. The kind of laugh that couldn't be faked for a camera. The kind that got caught rather than posed. Ethan looked at that laugh for a long time. He knew that laugh. Not her specifically, but the shape of it, the feeling behind it, the total careless happiness that only existed when a person felt completely safe, completely loved, completely certain that the moment they were in was a good one. Margaret had laughed like that, not as often as he wished he'd paid attention to, but enough times that he'd carried the memory of it the way other men carried photographs. He closed the wallet carefully. He stood up and his knees complained again, and he looked down the empty highway in both directions, and he made a decision that probably took him less than 30 seconds, but that he would spend months afterward thinking about. He didn't stand there wrestling with it. He didn't argue with himself about need versus right, or calculate whether anyone would ever know or construct justifications the way desperate people sometimes did when temptation came in the exact shape of the hole in their life. He just looked at the photograph again and thought about the person whose laugh that was, and then he thought about the person who kept that photograph loose in a wallet because they needed to be able to touch it. And something in his chest made the decision so quietly that his mind just followed along behind. He walked back to his truck and sat down and found the driver's license number in the wallet, and then with the methodical patience of a man who had spent 40 years diagnosing broken engines by process of elimination, he started working on how to find a phone number for a man named Jackson R. Morgan. It took him 40 minutes and 3 calls, one to information, one wrong number, one to a woman who said she didn't know any Jackson Morgan, but whose voice changed in a way that told Ethan she probably did. He left his own number with her. He wasn't surprised when his phone rang 12 minutes later. "Who is this?" It wasn't a question, it was a test. The voice was low and flat and carried the specific texture of authority that didn't need to be announced. Ethan had heard voices like that before, mostly from men who ran things shift, foremen, plant managers, the kind of people whose competence had calcified over time into something close to coldness. But this voice had something extra underneath it, something that had been through more than shift changes and production quotas. "My name is Ethan Carter," Ethan said. "I found a wallet this morning out near the old Sunridge station on 89A. The license inside says it belongs to you." Silence. Not the silence of surprise exactly. More like the silence of a man who was rapidly running several calculations at once and keeping his face completely still while he did it. "What do you want?" Jackson Morgan said. Ethan paused. It was a reasonable question. It was probably the question Jackson Morgan had learned to ask first in every situation for the last several decades. "I want to give it back," Ethan said. "That's all." Another silence. Longer this time. "Is everything still inside?" "Yes," Ethan said. "Every dollar." The silence that followed those 3 words was different from the ones before it. Ethan couldn't have explained exactly how, but it was different. There was something happening on the other end of that line that was more than calculation. "There's a photograph," Ethan said carefully, "of a young woman, blonde, on a motorcycle." The silence became total. When Jackson Morgan spoke again, his voice was the same flat controlled, carrying that quality of practice authority, but something underneath it had shifted by about 3 degrees in a direction Ethan couldn't name. "Where are you?" Jackson said. Ethan gave him his address. He expected to be told that someone would come by, a club member, or an associate, whoever Jackson Morgan sent on errands. He did not expect what came next. "I'll be there in an hour," Jackson said. "Don't go anywhere." The line went dead. Ethan set his phone down on the kitchen table beside the stack of envelopes he'd stopped opening and looked at the wallet sitting next to them. He had set it there when he came in, and now it sat between his past due notices and the silent phone like a strange kind of guest. He put a pot of coffee on. Not because he thought Jackson Morgan would want any. He put it on because he needed something to do with his hands, and because the smell of coffee brewing had always made the house feel less empty, and right now the house felt very empty, and also for the first time in a while like something was about to happen in it. The knock on the door came 53 minutes later. Ethan had expected one man. He had expected someone big, probably given the voice and the name, and the way the woman on the phone had responded when he mentioned that name. He had not expected the sound of multiple motorcycles in the gravel drive, or the particular quality of quiet that settled over his front yard before he opened the door, the kind of quiet that came from several people deciding simultaneously to be very still. There were 4 of them, Jackson Morgan in front and 3 men behind him, arranged in the loose, unconsciously territorial way that people arrange themselves when they'd spent a long time moving as a group. All of them in leather cuts the Hell's Angles patch, visible, the kind of men who took up more space than their physical dimensions entirely accounted for. Jackson Morgan was bigger than his license photograph had suggested. Not just tall, substantial, the kind of man who made you immediately aware of your own dimensions by comparison. The gray beard was shorter than Ethan had imagined it neater. His eyes were exactly what the license photo had communicated. They were eyes that had run their calculations on Ethan Carter before he'd finished opening the door and had reached some kind of preliminary conclusion. Though what conclusion Ethan couldn't yet read. Ethan opened the door wide. "You want to come in? I have coffee." The three men behind Jackson exchanged a look that Ethan caught but didn't interpret. Jackson Morgan looked at Ethan for a moment with an expression that wasn't quite assessment and wasn't quite surprised but was somewhere between the two. "Sure," he said. They sat at Ethan's kitchen table, Jackson and one of the others, while the remaining two stayed near the door, not guarding it exactly, just present in the way that men who moved with Jackson Morgan were apparently always present. Ethan poured coffee into the two best mugs he owned, which weren't very impressive mugs, and set them down without apology. He picked up the wallet from between the envelopes and slid it across the table. Jackson didn't reach for it immediately. He looked at Ethan's face first. Ethan had the sense that this was habitual, that Jackson Morgan had spent enough years reading rooms and reading people that he checked the source before he checked the object. Then he picked up the wallet and opened it. He went through it with the efficiency of a man who knew exactly what was in it and was confirming inventory rather than discovering it. The key, the cards, the license. And then his fingers found the photograph and the efficiency stopped. He held it the way Ethan had held it out by the highway, not looking at it yet, just feeling the weight of it for a moment, the way you braced yourself for something before you let it fully arrive. Then he looked at it. The man across the table became someone slightly different in that moment. Not weaker, that wasn't the word, but more real maybe, less armored. The careful, controlled blankness that had covered his face since Ethan opened the door developed a hairline crack just briefly, just long enough for Ethan to see the person underneath the reputation. The other man in the kitchen found something on the wall to look at. "Her name was Lily," Jackson Morgan said. His voice was still low, still flat, but something had shifted in the register beneath the words. "My daughter." Ethan didn't say he was sorry. He'd found in the 3 years since Margaret that people who said they were sorry mostly needed to say it for themselves, and what he wanted right now was to hear about Lily if Jackson wanted to talk about her. "She had a good laugh," Ethan said instead. Jackson's eyes moved from the photograph to Ethan. Something in them recalibrated. "Yeah," he said. "She did." Silence, but not a heavy one. "How long?" Ethan asked. Jackson looked at the photograph again. 6 years. Ethan nodded. He understood years measured that way. "Mine was 3 years ago," he said. "Margaret, my wife." Jackson looked at him steadily, waiting. "She was the only person I was always completely honest with," Ethan said. "And the things she always told me, the things she said every time I came home from work and complained about somebody doing something wrong and getting away with it, she'd say, 'Ethan, you don't get to decide what the world owes other people. You only get to decide what you owe the world.'" He paused. "That's why I called you." The kitchen was quiet. Outside, through the thin walls, Ethan could hear the wind moving through the scrub brush and the faint metallic tick of the motorcycles cooling down in the drive. Jackson Morgan set the photograph carefully on the table beside his coffee mug. He looked at the envelopes stacked beside where the wallet had been. He didn't ask about them. He didn't need to. A man who dealt in the kind of territory Jackson Morgan dealt in learned to read environments fast. In Ethan's kitchen, told a story that wasn't complicated, a man living on very little, doing it carefully and losing the fight a bill at a time. "You could have kept it," Jackson said. It wasn't an accusation. It was something he was working out, some math that didn't add up to any result he'd encountered before. "I could have," Ethan agreed. "So why didn't you?" Ethan thought about how to answer that honestly, the way Margaret would have wanted him to. Not the polished version, not the version that sounded better than the truth. "For about 10 seconds I thought about it," he said. "I'm not going to lie to you about that. 10 seconds where I thought about what that money could do, and I won't pretend those 10 seconds were nothing. But then I looked at that picture." He nodded toward the photograph of Lily on the table. "And I thought, whoever lost this wallet isn't just missing money. They're missing that, and you can't put a price on that and you don't replace it. And no amount of what I needed was worth the price of keeping someone away from something that mattered that much. Jackson Morgan was quiet for a long time, long enough that the other man in the kitchen shifted slightly in his seat. Then Jackson said, "I've sat across tables from men who controlled more money than most people see in a lifetime. Men who would have negotiations with us, deals arrangements. And every single one of them, everyone was thinking about what they could get, what the angle was, what percentage of the outcome came back to them." He looked at Ethan steadily. "In 40 years, I've never once had somebody just give me something back and not want anything for it." "I don't want anything," Ethan said. "I told you that on the phone." "I know you did." Jackson paused. "That's why I came myself." The afternoon wore on. Jackson's men drifted in and out of the kitchen, and at some point someone produced sandwiches from somewhere. Ethan never fully tracked the logistics, and the kitchen became, in the strange way that unfamiliar things sometimes did in small houses, occupied and inhabited in a way it hadn't been since Margaret. Jackson asked questions not aggressively, but with the sustained curiosity of someone who had decided he wanted to understand something and was going to stay until he did. About Margaret, about how long Ethan had worked as a mechanic, about what it was like to grow up in Arizona before the highways made everything smaller. Ethan answered everything plainly, the way he'd answered everything his whole life, not performing modesty, not adding texture to make himself seem more interesting, just the facts of a life lived honestly in the modest circumstances it had been given. At one point, Ethan got up to refill the coffee and came back to find Jackson looking at the stack of envelopes that had been sitting at the edge of the table the whole afternoon. "Bank?" Jackson asked. Ethan sat down. "Mortgage company mostly, some medical. The pension covers what it covers, and the rest has been catching up to me for about a year now." Jackson turned one of the envelopes over. He didn't open it, he wouldn't do that without being asked. But he looked at the return address and something moved across his face. "Apex Lending," he said. Something in his voice when he said it was different from the careful neutrality he'd maintained most of the afternoon. Just a degree or two off, not angry exactly, but specific. Like the name meant something particular. "You know them?" Ethan asked. "I know of them," Jackson said. "They've got a history of going after properties in outlying areas. Older owners, people who might not know what their options are." He set the envelope down precisely. "What are they saying you owe?" Ethan told him the number. Jackson looked at the envelope for another moment. Then he looked at Ethan. "You have the original loan documents, or somewhere," Ethan said. "In the filing cabinet in the back room. Margaret kept everything organized. I haven't," he stopped. "I haven't gone through most of it since she passed." "Could you find them tonight?" Ethan looked at him. "Why?" "Because I know someone who looks at these kinds of agreements for a living," Jackson said. "And some of what these outfits do isn't as settled as they want you to believe it is." Ethan was quiet for a moment. He'd never had help navigating paperwork. He'd never asked for any. He was 72 years old and he'd solved his own problems his whole life mostly by working harder or going without, and the idea of someone else looking at his financial situation had the same quality of vulnerability that he imagined other people felt when they had to ask for directions. But Margaret's voice had gotten him through harder moments than this one. "I'll find them," he said. Jackson nodded once. He reached into his cut and pulled out a card, no title on it, just a phone number handwritten in ink. "When you find them, you call that number," he said. "Ask for Reyes. Tell him I sent you." Ethan took the card. The men left as the sun was going low, the sound of engines starting up in sequence and then pulling out onto the road. Ethan stood at his front door and watched the taillights disappear around the bend at the end of his drive. Then he went to the kitchen and looked at the table where they had all been sitting for the last several hours, at the coffee mugs and the sandwich wrappers and the envelopes still stacked where they'd always been stacked, and the wallet gone now, and the card Jackson had left sitting precisely where the wallet used to be. He sat down. He sat there for a long time in the kitchen that had been full of people a few minutes ago and was now quiet again, and the quiet felt different from the way it usually felt. Not empty, changed. He reached into the pile of envelopes and found the one from Apex Lending and held it for a moment. Then for the first time in 3 months, he opened it. He read it carefully the way Margaret had always read everything, not skimming, actually reading. Then he set it down on the table and picked up Jackson Morgan's card. He sat there thinking about what Margaret would have said, not about the wallet or the decision he'd made that morning. She would have had no argument with any of that, but about this. about a door opening in the wall he'd been walking along for 3 years in the dark, looking for a break in it and not finding one. He thought she probably would have said something simple, something with the particular practical clarity that had always been her gift. She probably would have said, "A door only matters if you walk through it, Ethan." He set Jackson's card on top of the Apex Lending envelope. And then he went to the back room and he opened Margaret's filing cabinet for the first time since she died, and he started looking for the documents that might be the beginning of something he hadn't believed was coming anymore. He didn't know yet what it would change. He didn't know who Reyes was or what Jackson Morgan's version of help looked like, or whether any of it would matter to a mortgage company that had been sending him letters for 8 months. But he knew what had happened at the abandoned gas station that morning had been right. And he knew that Margaret had been right. And he knew that somehow out of a crack in the asphalt beside an empty highway, the day had opened into something he hadn't seen the edges of yet. The filing cabinet drawer slid open. The smell of her organizational system, the particular paper and cedar smell of a life carefully documented, came up to meet him. And Ethan Carter stood there in the back room of the small house where everything had happened to him. And he breathed it in and he started looking. The filing cabinet had 7 drawers. Margaret had organized them by category: mortgage, insurance, medical vehicle taxes, miscellaneous, and the last one she'd simply labeled important in her careful handwriting on a strip of masking tape. Ethan had opened that last drawer first, without really deciding, to the way your hands sometimes move toward the thing your brain wasn't ready to consciously choose. Inside, rubber banded together with a yellow sticky note on top that said, "House documents." All of them, Ethan. Not just the ones you think you need, was everything. The original loan agreement, the modification paperwork from 2019, the payment history she'd printed and highlighted, the correspondence going back 8 years. He stood there holding the rubber-banded stack and felt something move through his chest that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite gratitude, but lived in the same neighborhood as both. She had known somehow. Margaret had always known which pile was the one that would matter later. He carried the documents to the kitchen table, sat down under the overhead light, and called the number on Jackson's card. It was past 9 in the evening. He didn't expect anyone to answer. Someone answered on the second ring. "Reyes." The voice was younger than Ethan expected, precise, carrying the slightly clipped efficiency of someone who was used to receiving information and processing it fast. "My name is Ethan Carter," Ethan said. "Jackson Morgan told me to call this number." A brief pause. "Yes, sir. What have you got?" Ethan explained the situation in the same plain, sequential way he'd always explained. Broken engines start with what you know, describe what you observed, don't speculate until the evidence runs out. Apex Lending, the original loan amount, the modification, the current demand letters figure in the number they said he owed versus the number his own records showed. Reyes listened without interrupting. Then he asked 3 questions, specific technical questions about the modification terms and the compounding language in the demand. And when Ethan read him the relevant passages word for word, Reyes went quiet for a moment. That felt like it had weight in it. "Mr. Carter," Reyes said carefully, "can you scan or photograph those documents and send them to me tonight?" "I've got a phone," Ethan said. "I can take pictures." "Do that. Every page. Don't skip anything that looks routine. The routine pages are where they hide things." "What kind of things?" Ethan asked. "The kind of things," Reyes said, "that aren't legal in Arizona under the 2017 modifications to the consumer lending statute. But we need to see it in your specific paperwork before I say anything more than that." Ethan took the pictures. 43 pages. He sent them to the number Reyes texted him one by one, with the methodical patience of a man who had learned precision from 40 years of working with tolerances, measured in thousandths of an inch. Then he sat at the kitchen table and waited. His phone rang at 11:47. "Mr. Carter," Reyes said, and his voice was different now, still precise, but with something underneath it that hadn't been there before, a controlled energy that reminded Ethan of the moment a diagnostic finally pointed clearly at the problem. "I need you to listen carefully." Ethan listened. What Reyes explained took 20 minutes and involved terminology that Ethan only partially followed, but the shape of it came through clearly. Apex Lending had applied a compounding structure to his modification agreement that was specifically prohibited by a statute Reyes cited by number. The amount they were claiming he owed was not the amount he legally owed. The difference was significant. And the timeline of their communications, The escalating letter cadence matched a pattern Reyes had seen before with this particular company, one that was designed to pressure property owners into either paying the inflated amount or selling before anyone looked too closely at the underlying math. "So what does that mean?" Ethan said when Reyes finished. "It means," Reyes said, "that if they take this to any competent court, they lose. And it means that if we send them a very specific letter citing the statute and the specific provisions they violated, there's a reasonable chance they decide you're not worth the exposure and they restructure to your actual legal obligation." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "Why haven't they been caught doing this before?" he asked. "Because most of the people they do it to don't have anyone to look at the documents," Reyes said simply. "And most of the people they do it to don't know they have options. So they either pay the wrong number or they lose the property and Apex moves to the next one." The rage that moved through Ethan in that moment was quiet and very cold, which was the kind of rage that had always been most dangerous in him, the kind that didn't explode but instead organized itself into purpose. "You said a letter," Ethan said. "I'll draft it," Reyes said. "I'll have it to you by morning. Read it, and if you're comfortable with it, we send it certified mail and we see what they do." After he hung up, Ethan sat at the table for a long time. He thought about all the envelopes he hadn't opened, all the months he'd spent believing the problem was his debt rather than their dishonesty, all the mornings he'd walked the highway shoulder collecting scrap metal to cover a number that apparently wasn't even the right number. He picked up Jackson Morgan's card and looked at it. He had returned a wallet that morning expecting nothing, and something had come back to him anyway. He didn't understand the mechanism of it yet. He wasn't sure it had a mechanism or that the word mechanism was even the right framework. But he sat in his kitchen at nearly midnight with 43 pages of documentation that might change everything, and he thought about the wallet and the photograph and the 10 seconds he'd spent being tempted by the cash, and he felt something that was close to what Margaret had called rightness. The specific, quiet feeling of a thing falling into the correct alignment. He went to bed. He didn't sleep immediately. He lay in the dark and listened to the desert doing its nighttime work. And he thought about Jackson Morgan sitting at the same kitchen table 8 hours ago looking at the photograph of his daughter. He thought about the hairline crack he'd seen in the man's face when he looked at it. He thought about what it cost to carry a loss that size for 6 years and still function at the level Jackson Morgan functioned at, still run something, still be the person others organize themselves around. He fell asleep thinking about that. The draft letter from Reyes was in his email when he woke up. Ethan read it twice slowly. He didn't fully understand every legal reference, but the architecture of it was clear. It was precise. It was specific. It named exact provisions and exact violations, and it communicated without ambiguity that the person sending it understood exactly what Apex Lending had done and was prepared to pursue that understanding through channels Apex would find expensive and inconvenient. He read it a third time, then he called Reyes back. "Send it," Ethan said. He spent that morning on his usual route not because he needed the scrap metal any more urgently than usual, but because the routine of it was grounding and because he was a man who had worked through difficult things better when his hands were occupied. He walked the highway shoulder. He found a section of copper pipe and a car antenna and about 2 pounds of mixed aluminum. He filled his bag and carried it back to the truck and drove to the scrap yard and came home with $22. He put it in the coffee can on the kitchen counter where he kept cash, and he made lunch and he was washing his single plate when his phone rang. It was Jackson, not a club member, not Reyes, Jackson himself. "Reyes called me," Jackson said, "told me what he found." "He's drafting a letter," Ethan said. "Already sent it this morning." A pause. "You move fast." "When something needs doing," Ethan said. Another pause, this one different. More like Jackson was deciding something. "I want to ask you something," Jackson said. "Go ahead." "When you found that wallet, those first 10 seconds you told me about." He stopped. "What would your wife have said if you'd kept it?" Ethan didn't answer right away. He set the plate down on the counter and leaned against the sink. "She wouldn't have said anything," he said finally. "She wouldn't have needed to. She would have just looked at me and I would have already known." The silence on the line was long enough that Ethan wondered if the call had dropped. "My daughter was like that," Jackson said. "Lily, she could look at me and I couldn't." He stopped, started again. "She was the only person I couldn't lie to, not even the comfortable lies, not even the ones I told myself." Ethan was quiet. She would have been 31 last week, Jackson said. I know, Ethan said. I didn't say that yesterday because I didn't think you'd want me to say it, but I looked at the date on her photograph. Jackson didn't respond to that, but Ethan heard him exhale, which was a kind of response. The reason I'm calling, Jackson said, switching back to the flat practical register, is that a few of my guys are going to come by tomorrow morning. Ethan waited. Reyes told me about the house, Jackson said. Not just the financial situation, the actual structure. He looked at the county property records while he was in the file. Ethan frowned. What about the structure? He said the county shows 2 unresolved maintenance violations on the property. Did you know that? Ethan was quiet. He had known in the vague, uncomfortable way you knew things you couldn't currently afford to address. The roof had been flagged 2 years ago. There was a notice about the exterior drainage. He had filed the paperwork to acknowledge the violations and then filed nothing further because there was nothing further he could do. They can use those to accelerate the Apex situation, Jackson said. If the property is cited, it affects the loan standing. It gives them another angle. Ethan felt a familiar cold rage again. I didn't know they could do that, he said. A lot of people don't, Jackson said. That's the point. He paused. So some of my guys are coming tomorrow. Don't argue with them about it. I'm not in the habit of accepting charity, Ethan said. Good, Jackson said, because this isn't charity. This is us doing something because we want to do it, and you're going to let us because you're smart enough to know the difference between someone helping you and someone owing you. Ethan opened his mouth and closed it again. 9 o'clock, Jackson said and hung up. They arrived at 8:57, 7 of them. Trucks this time, 2 pickup trucks and a cargo van alongside 3 motorcycles. Ethan was standing at his front door with a coffee mug when they pulled in, and he watched them climb out and start unloading with the efficient, purposeful energy of people who had decided on a task and were not interested in discussing it. A man who introduced himself as Decker, somewhere in his 40s, the kind of build that came from actual physical work, rather than any kind of gym, with a handshake that communicated a complete lifetime of getting things done. Walked up to Ethan and said, "Morning. I'm going to need to get on your roof first. After that, we'll look at the drainage situation on the north side. You got anything inside that needs attention while we're here?" Ethan looked at him. He thought about arguing. He thought about dignity and independence and every other value he'd built his identity around for 7 decades. Then he thought about what Jackson had said. The kitchen faucet has had a slow drip for about 4 months, Ethan said. The back door sticks in its frame, and there's a section of flooring in the hallway that's soft. I don't know if it's the subfloor or something underneath. Decker pulled out a small notebook and wrote all 3 down. We'll get to those after the exterior. You don't need to hover. Go have your coffee. Ethan went and had his coffee. The morning had a particular quality to it that he was having trouble categorizing. His house was full of the sounds of work boots on the roof, the clang of tools, conversation, and short functional bursts between men who communicated efficiently because they'd worked together long enough to have a shared language. These were sounds Ethan recognized, sounds that had been the texture of his own working life for 40 years. Hearing them in his own house, directed at the problems that had been quietly accumulating around him, produced an emotion he couldn't have named cleanly. Not helplessness, not a gratitude exactly. Something more complicated than either. Something that sat at the intersection of pride and relief and the particular vulnerability of being seen clearly enough that someone knew what you needed before you could ask for it. A younger man named Thomas came to the back door with a kit of tools and spent 25 minutes on the faucet and another 10 on the doorframe, and came to find Ethan afterward in the kitchen to tell him the hallway section was the subfloor, not structural, and they'd have it sorted by noon. You do this kind of work regularly? Ethan asked. Tomas shrugged, the easy shrug of someone whose answer to that question was more complicated than the question allowed for. When it needs doing. For strangers. Tomas looked at him for a moment with an expression that was something between amusement and something older and more serious. You're not a stranger, he said. Jackson told us about you. What did he tell you? He told us what you did, Tomas said. With the wallet. He paused. He's not a man who tells us things about people very often. When he does, it means something. Ethan thought about it after Tomas went back to work. He thought about what it meant that a story as simple as returning a lost wallet, a decision that had taken him less than 30 seconds, a decision that he still didn't entirely understand why, required any acknowledgement at all, had traveled through a community of people he'd never met and produced this. 7 men in his driveway, a legal expert reading his documents the night before. A phone call from a man who had shared something about his daughter that Ethan suspected he didn't share often or easily. He was still thinking about it when his phone rang. The number was unfamiliar local area code, but not one he recognized. Mr. Carter, a woman's voice, professional, clipped with the particular quality of someone who made calls like this as a routine function of a job. I'm calling from Apex Lending's compliance department regarding a letter we received this morning. Ethan felt everything in him go very still. Yes, he said. I'm calling to discuss the contents of the letter and to understand if there's been some miscommunication regarding your account. Miscommunication. Ethan thought about Reyes's letter, about the specific statute numbers and the precise violation language and the detailed accounting of exactly how Apex had constructed a number that wasn't the legal number. I don't think there's been a miscommunication, Ethan said. I think the letter says what it says. A brief pause. Mr. Carter, I want to make sure you're aware that we have legal counsel on retainer and that, I'm sure you do, Ethan said, and I'm sure they can read the same statute that my representative cited. So why don't you tell me what you're actually calling to say? Another pause, longer, the kind that happened when someone went slightly off script and was recalibrating. We'd like to schedule a time to discuss the account, the woman said, and her voice had dropped about half a degree of its professional warmth. My representative handles those discussions, Ethan said. His contact information is in the letter. He ended the call. He sat very still for a moment. Then he called Reyes. They called me, Ethan said when Reyes picked up. Already, Reyes's voice was alert. What did they say? They want to schedule a discussion. I told them to contact you. A brief silence. You handled that well. Don't answer if they call again. They wrote everything to me. Another pause. The fact that they called you directly instead of responding through the legal channel tells me something. What does it tell you? It tells me they're hoping to resolve this without putting anything in writing, Reyes said, which tells me they know exactly what we found. A beat. Mr. Carter, I think Apex is going to fold on this. I don't know how fast, and I don't know the exact terms yet, but I've seen this pattern before. When they call the person instead of the lawyer, they're looking for a softer exit than the legal route gives them. Ethan absorbed that. How long has this been happening? He asked. Not his case specifically. The pattern. Reyes was quiet for a moment. Longer than it should have been allowed to, he said. These outfits target people who are isolated from the kind of help that would let them fight back. Elderly homeowners, people in rural areas, people who have assets, the house, the land, but limited access to legal resources. They've probably run this same structure on dozens of properties in Arizona alone. The cold rage was back, but it had a different shape now than it had the night before. The night before, it had been about Ethan's own situation, his own months of fear and avoidance, and the exhausting arithmetic of a man trying to keep what was his. Now it was larger than that. If we send them to court, Ethan said carefully, and the violation is documented in the record, it becomes public, Reyes said. Yes, which is why they're going to try very hard to settle privately. And if I don't let them, Ethan said. The silence on the other end lasted long enough that Ethan could hear Reyes breathing. Mr. Carter, Reyes said slowly, that would be a longer process and a harder one. It would mean this doesn't get resolved for you quickly. It might drag out. It might get complicated, and there's no guarantee of how it ends. I understand that, Ethan said. Why be so? Reyes asked, not skeptically, genuinely wanting to know. Ethan thought about it for a moment. He thought about the stack of unopened envelopes. He thought about the morning walk along the highway. He thought about what Reyes had said, they target people who are isolated from help. And he thought about how many people in outlying Arizona towns were right now sitting at kitchen tables, staring at letters from Apex Lending, and believing the number in those letters was the true number. Because I'm not the only one they've done this to, Ethan said. And I'm probably the first one who's in a position where fighting it doesn't cost me anything I can't afford to lose. Reyes was quiet again. I'll need to talk to Jackson, he said finally. You do that, Ethan said. I'll wait. Jackson called back in 40 minutes. By that time, Decker had come down off the roof and found Ethan in the kitchen, and given him a rundown of what they'd fixed and what they'd caught before it became a problem. And the conversation had been practical and plain in the way that Ethan appreciated two men talking about materials and structural integrity and the particular Arizona weather conditions that shorten the life of certain kinds of roofing seal. When Jackson called, Ethan walked outside to take it. "Reyes told me what you're thinking," Jackson said. And I think, Jackson said, and there was something in his voice that Ethan hadn't heard before, not surprise exactly, but something adjacent to it, something that might have been the sound of a man revising an estimate upward. "That you are not what I expected when I showed up at your house yesterday." "I'm exactly what I've always been," Ethan said. "I know," Jackson said. "That's what I mean." A pause. "If you're going to push this to court, you need more than Reyes. You need someone with standing to file, and that's a different kind of resource." "Do you have that kind of resource?" Ethan asked. "The Hells Angels have been dealing with legal situations for 40 years, Jackson said dryly. "We know attorneys the way mechanics know parts suppliers." "Then the question is whether you think it's worth it," Ethan said. "The question," Jackson said, "is whether you understand what you're starting." Ethan turned that over. He understood it, he thought, as well as a man could understand something he'd decided about 3 minutes into a phone conversation. But some decisions had a quality to them, the same quality he'd felt on the highway shoulder holding the wallet, where the rightness of the thing arrived faster than the reasoning, and the reasoning just had to catch up. "I understand enough," Ethan said. Jackson was quiet for a moment. "Decker's still there?" he asked. "Just finished up," Ethan said. "Ask him to stay. I'm going to come by." He arrived an hour later, this time alone. No motorcycles behind him. He pulled up in a truck that had the particular unself-conscious practicality of a vehicle that was driven hard and maintained carefully, and he climbed out and came to the door, and Ethan let him in, and they sat at the same kitchen table where they'd sat the day before. Jackson looked at the kitchen, at the faucet that no longer dripped, at the door that no longer stuck, at the space where the envelopes had been stacked. Ethan had moved them to the counter. "Reyes thinks Apex will settle," Jackson said. "I know," Ethan said. "I don't want them to." Jackson studied him. "Say that again so I'm sure I heard it." "I don't want them to settle privately," Ethan said. "I want what they did on record, not because I need the fight, but because if it's not on record, they move to the next person and the next, and it never stops." Jackson Morgan looked at Ethan Carter for a long time, long enough that Ethan felt it the specific weight of being seen by someone who was very good at seeing people who did it professionally and continuously, and who was currently performing that function on him with full attention. "You know what the funny thing is," Jackson said. "Tell me." "I've spent 40 years building something that most people are afraid of," Jackson said. "Most of what we've done, the good things, the things I'm actually proud of, we've had to do quietly, because the reputation works against us when we try to do anything openly. We can't stand up in a courtroom and advocate for somebody without it becoming about us instead of about them." He paused. "You could." Ethan understood what he was saying. "A 72-year-old retired mechanic," Ethan said, "who returned a biker's wallet," Jackson said, "and found out his mortgage company was running an illegal scheme and decided to do something about it." He looked at Ethan steadily. "That's a story people listen to. That's a story nobody can make into something other than what it is." The word story landed on Ethan in a way he hadn't expected. He'd spent the last 2 days thinking about this entirely in terms of documents and legal statutes and practical next steps. He hadn't thought about what it looked like from the outside. "I'm not interested in being a story," Ethan said. "Good," Jackson said, "because what I need you to be is a plaintiff." He leaned forward slightly. "There are 3 other property owners in Yavapai County that Reyes has identified in the last 6 hours who are carrying Apex modifications with the same compounding structure. At least one of them has already received a foreclosure notice." Ethan went very still. "How fast can you talk to them?" he asked. "Reyes is already making calls," Jackson said. The 2 men sat at the kitchen table while the afternoon light shifted and Decker moved around in the background, finishing the last items on his list, and they talked about what it would take and what it would mean and what the risks were on both sides and what the alternative was if nothing was done. At one point, Jackson's phone rang and he looked at the number and set it face down on the table without answering it. His attention didn't waver. At another point, Ethan made a third pot of coffee, and Jackson Morgan, the president of the most feared motorcycle club in northern Arizona, sat at a retired mechanic's kitchen table and drank it out of a mug that said "World's Okayest Fisherman," that had been a gag gift from Margaret's brother at Christmas 15 years ago. Neither of them mentioned the mug. When Decker came in to say he was done and leaving, Jackson nodded and said, "Thank you, Decker." And Decker said, "See you, boss," and left, and then it was just the two of them again. Outside, the desert was doing what it always did in the last hour before sundown, holding all its heat close for one final hour before releasing it to the night sky. Ethan had lived in Arizona his whole life, and he still wasn't sure whether he loved or hated that hour. It was very honest in its way. All that banked heat impossible to pretend away. "What do you need from me?" Ethan asked. "Right now," Jackson said. "I need you to call Reyes tomorrow morning and tell him you want to proceed on the litigation path. He'll walk you through the rest." He paused. "And I need you to understand that when this starts moving, it might draw attention. To you. To this situation." "What kind of attention?" Jackson's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. The kind that comes when a company realizes that the quiet solution isn't available anymore. Ethan thought about that. "I've been a mechanic for 40 years, he said. "I've had parts suppliers try to overcharge me, and manufacturers try to avoid warranties they knew were valid, and shop owners tell me stories about what was and wasn't my legal recourse. I've been managing people who didn't want to be managed my whole life." He looked at Jackson. "I'm 72. I own my house, or I will when this is done. I don't have much left that they can threaten." "They'll try anyway," Jackson said. "Let them," Ethan said. Jackson picked up his coffee mug. He looked at the kitchen, at the window, at the counter, at the filing cabinet drawer that was still partially open from where Ethan had retrieved Margaret's documents the night before. "Tell me something," he said. "What?" "When you called me," Jackson said, "when you made that first call, did you know any of this was coming?" Ethan thought about it honestly, the way Margaret had always required of him. "No," he said. "I wasn't thinking about what was coming. I was thinking about the photograph of your daughter and the fact that it didn't belong to me." He paused. "That's all I was thinking about." Jackson nodded once. The way he nodded wasn't an acknowledgement of something simple. It was the nod of a man who had lived long enough and hard enough to understand the weight of doing the right thing without any expectation of return, and who had not seen that demonstrated very often, and who was filing it away somewhere permanent. "All right," Jackson said. He stood up. "I'll talk to Reyes tonight. He'll call you first thing." He moved toward the door. Ethan followed. At the threshold, Jackson stopped and turned back. He looked at Ethan the way he'd looked at him at the clubhouse in the story. The men were already starting to tell the old man who'd come to the door of the Hells Angels without hesitation, carrying a wallet that wasn't his, returning every dollar. The look of a man who was still doing the math on something that kept coming out differently than he expected. "The lawyers I'm going to connect you with," he said, "they don't charge in cases like this. They work on contingency when there's a public record interest." He paused. "I want you to know that so you don't spend the next week worrying about it." Ethan nodded. "And I want you to know something else," Jackson said. Ethan waited. "Lily would have liked you," Jackson Morgan said. He walked out to his truck. The engine started. The taillights moved down the drive and disappeared around the bend for the second time in 2 days. Ethan stood at his open door. The night air came in off the desert, warm and dry, and carrying the specific smell of the scrub brush after a day's heat, a smell Ethan had known his entire life, a smell that was completely indistinguishable in his memory from the smell of home. He stood there for a long time. Then he went inside and he sat down at the kitchen table, and he looked at the space where the envelopes had been, and he thought about what it meant that a man who'd spent his whole life doing the next right thing quietly, without announcement, without expectation of return, could find himself at 72 at the beginning of something. He picked up his phone. He called Reyes' number. "I know it's late," he said when Reyes picked up, "but tomorrow morning, first thing, I want to move forward." "I know," Reyes said. "Jackson already called me." "Of course he did," Ethan said. "Mr. Carter," Reyes said. And there was something in his voice that was younger than his professional efficiency, something that was closer to what Ethan would have called conviction. "I want you to know what you started here by returning that wallet. I don't think you understand yet what it might turn into." Ethan looked at the open filing cabinet drawer across the room, at the rubber-banded stack of Margaret's careful documentation. at the sticky note in her handwriting that he'd left sitting on the kitchen counter when he brought the documents out. House documents, all of them, Ethan. Not just the ones you think you need. I think maybe I'm starting to, he said. Reyes called at 7:58 the next morning, 2 minutes before the hour, which told Ethan something about the man that he'd been ready at 7:45 and made himself wait so as not to seem impatient, but couldn't hold it the full distance to 8. We have a problem, Reyes said without preamble. Ethan was standing at the kitchen counter with his first cup of coffee. He set it down. Tell me. I found a fourth property owner last night. Man named Gerald Shue, 78 years old, lives out past Ash Fork. His foreclosure notice isn't a notice anymore. Apex filed the actual proceeding 3 days ago. Reyes paused, and the pause had the weight of someone who'd been up most of the night with information they didn't like. If we're going to include him in anything we build, we need to move faster than I told you last night. A lot faster. How fast? I need to be in front of a judge with a temporary injunction by end of business Friday, Reyes said. That's 4 days. Ethan looked at the clock on the microwave. Wednesday morning. What do you need from me? He said. I need you to sign an authorization today that lets me act as your representative in all communications with Apex. I can email it to you in the next 10 minutes. He paused. And I need Jackson to make a call. What kind of call? The kind he's better at than I am, Reyes said simply. Ethan called Jackson before Reyes's email had finished downloading. Jackson picked up on the first ring, which meant he'd been awake already, which meant Reyes had probably already called him, which meant the two of them had already had a version of this conversation, and Jackson was waiting for Ethan to arrive at the decision they had both already reached. Gerald Shue, Ethan said. I know, Jackson said. Reyes needs you to make a call. Already made it, Jackson said. There's an attorney in Phoenix named Darla Campos. She handles exactly this kind of case, and she has standing in Yavapai County. She's already looking at what Reyes sent her. A brief pause. She's good, Ethan. She's the kind of good that makes opposing counsel check their filing twice. Ethan absorbed that. How do you know her? A short silence. She handled something for the club about 8 years ago. I don't need to get into what. What matters is that she won, and the reason she won was that she was smarter than everyone else in the room, and she knew it and didn't waste time pretending otherwise. Is she going to be a problem? Ethan asked. Representing someone connected to the Hells Angels in a consumer lending case. She's not representing the club, Jackson said. She's representing Shue, and Gerald Shue, and the others. His voice carried the specific flatness of a man who had navigated this particular distinction many times and was tired of explaining it. Our involvement is logistical. We found the people, we connected the dots, we made the calls. That's it. What happens in the courtroom is about Apex lending and what they did to homeowners, not about us. Ethan understood. He'd been a mechanic long enough to know that the person who diagnosed the problem wasn't always the person who fixed it, and that knowing the difference was half the job. Tell Campos I'll sign whatever she needs, Ethan said. She'll be at your place by noon, Jackson said. He said it as though this was a normal thing. A Phoenix attorney driving 3 hours to a small Arizona desert town to sit at a retired mechanic's kitchen table. Ethan started to say something about that, and then decided not to. He was learning slowly that Jackson Morgan's world operated at a different velocity than the world Ethan had always inhabited, and that the appropriate response was usually to get out of the way and let it move. Darla Campos arrived at 11:47. She drove herself a practical sedan, nothing showy, and she came to the door carrying a leather briefcase and a cup of gas station coffee that she was still drinking, which told Ethan she'd left Phoenix early and hadn't stopped. She was somewhere in her early 50s, compact and precise, with the particular quality of stillness that Ethan associated with people who spent a lot of time in courtrooms, the learned ability to occupy a space without performing anything. She looked at Ethan Carter standing in his doorway and said, "You're the man who started all of this." "I returned a wallet," Ethan said. She came inside, set her briefcase on the kitchen table with the efficiency of someone who'd been setting briefcases on kitchen tables her whole career, and opened it. "Jackson tells me you're not interested in a private settlement." "Not if it means Apex keeps operating the same way," Ethan said. She looked up at him. Her eyes were dark and direct, and assessed without pretending not to. "Do you understand what that means in practical terms, for you specifically? It means this takes longer, Ethan said. It means I'm probably still dealing with Apex for the next year or more. It means there's no guarantee of exactly what I recover or when. It also means, she said, that your name and your situation become part of a public record. That this house, this address, your financial details, they become part of a filing that anyone can look up. Ethan was quiet for a moment. He thought about Margaret's systematic filing, about 43 pages of documents photographed by the light of his kitchen, about Gerald Shue, 78 years old and 3 days into an active foreclosure proceeding. How many other people has Apex done this to in Arizona? He asked. Campos looked at him steadily. Reyes has identified 6 so far. I think when we pull the full filing history, we find more, possibly significantly more. Then the answer to your question, Ethan said, is that I understand. She held his gaze for another 2 seconds. Then she turned back to her briefcase and began pulling out documents. All right, let's talk about what we're going to build. They worked for 3 hours. Ethan signed things and initialed things and answered questions with the same precision he'd always brought to diagnostic work. No speculation, no inflation, just the facts in the order they'd occurred. Campos asked hard questions and didn't accept vague answers, and Ethan respected her for both things. She reminded him in some fundamental way of the best of the old engineers he'd worked alongside, people who demanded exactness. Not because they were cold, but because they understood that exactness was the only real form of respect you could pay a complicated problem. At one point, she looked it up from the documents and said, "Jackson says your wife organized all of this." "Yes," Ethan said. "Smart woman," Campos said, and went back to the documents. It was the right thing to say, and she said it the right way, briefly, genuinely, without pressing it into something sentimental. And Ethan found himself grateful for that in a way that surprised him. She left at 3:15 with everything she needed. At the door, she paused and looked at him. "I'm going to file for the injunction tomorrow morning," she said. "In the meantime, if Apex contacts you in any form, phone, mail, in person, you do not respond. You call Reyes or you call me directly." She handed him a card, not a business card, a plain white card with a handwritten number. "That's my cell. Use it if you need to." "Thank you," Ethan said. She studied him briefly. "Thank me when we're done," she said, and walked to her car. That evening, Ethan sat at his kitchen table and did something he hadn't done in months. He opened every single remaining envelope in the stack on his counter. He read every letter from Apex, every bank notice, every bill he'd been avoiding. He made a list, his own list, in his own handwriting, not in Margaret's careful system, but in the working mechanic's shorthand he'd always used, of every outstanding amount, and its status, and what Campos had told him was and wasn't legally enforceable. He discovered, working through the math with the documents and Reyes' analysis side by side, that the amount Apex claimed he owed was inflated by more than 30%. He sat with that number for a long time. 30%. Months of highway walks, months of $22 scrap metal runs, months of not opening envelopes because the number inside them was a false number constructed by people who bet that he would never have someone like Reyes look at it. The cold rage was back, and this time it didn't pass quickly. He let it sit. He thought it deserved to sit. His phone rang at 9 that night. Unknown number, local area code. He answered it. "Mr. Carter?" A man's voice. Older, measured with a quality of authority that was different from Jackson Morgan's softer, more practiced, the authority of someone accustomed to boardrooms rather than clubhouses. "My name is Vincent Cray. I'm the Regional Vice President of Apex Lending's Arizona portfolio." Ethan said nothing. "I understand you've engaged legal counsel," Cray said, "and I want to reach out personally, not through official channels, to see if there's a conversation we could have that might be more productive than litigation." "My attorney has your counsel's contact information," Ethan said. "Of course," Cray said smoothly, "but sometimes these things can be resolved more efficiently with a direct conversation. Less formal, more human." He paused. "We have a great deal of respect for your situation, Mr. Carter. We're aware that the last several months have been difficult. We'd like to find a way to make this right for you personally." Ethan thought about the phrase "more human." He thought about the 6 property owners Reyes had identified and the number Campos suspected when the full filing history was pulled. He thought about Gerald Shue at 78, with an active foreclosure on the property he'd spent his life building. "Contact my attorney," Ethan said. and ended the call. He immediately called Reyes and reported the conversation word for word. Reyes was quiet for a moment. Then Vincent Cray called you directly. Yes. From his personal phone, not an Apex line. Unknown number, Ethan said. Local area code. Another pause. Ethan. It was the first time Reyes had used his first name. Vincent Cray is not someone who calls homeowners directly. He runs a 7-state portfolio. The fact that he is calling you personally off the record tells me that someone at Apex has reviewed what Darla filed today for the injunction and has understood exactly what it means if this goes forward. What does it mean? Ethan asked. It means discovery, Reyes said. It means every modification agreement in their Arizona portfolio becomes subject to scrutiny. Every single one. If the same compounding structure appears systematically, and I believe it does, then this isn't a case about your house anymore. It's a case about a pattern of fraud across multiple properties. Ethan held his phone and looked at the list he'd made in his own handwriting on the kitchen table. That's why he called, Ethan said. That's why he called, Reyes confirmed. He wanted to settle before discovery, before we even formally asked for it, Reyes said, which we will do the moment the injunction is granted. He paused. Don't speak to Cray again. Don't speak to anyone from Apex. If they contact you through any channel, route it to Darla. Already told him to call her, Ethan said. A short silence that Ethan recognized by now as Reyes recalibrating. You handled it right, Reyes said. After he hung up, Ethan sat for a moment and then called Jackson. He told him about Cray's call. He told him what Reyes had said about discovery. Jackson listened without interrupting. When Ethan finished, Jackson said, How are you doing with all of this? It was an unexpected question, not because it was strange, it was exactly the right question, but because Ethan hadn't expected Jackson Morgan to be the one asking it. He'd expected more strategy, more logistics, more of the controlled forward motion that had characterized every conversation since the wallet. I'm all right, Ethan said. And then because honesty had always been his operating mode and because Jackson had earned it, I'm angrier than I've been in a long time. That's not a bad thing, it's clarifying. Good, Jackson said. Anger that makes you clear is useful. Anger that makes you reckless isn't. A pause. Is there anything you need tonight? Ethan looked around his kitchen, at the list, at the organized paperwork, at the coffee mug that said World's Okayest Fisherman sitting clean and upside down on the drying rack where he'd left it after washing it the night before. No, he said. I think I'm good. Get some sleep, Jackson said. Tomorrow's going to move fast. He was right. Campos filed at 8:15 Friday morning, and the injunction hearing was set for 2 in the afternoon. Ethan drove himself to the Yavapai County Courthouse, which was a 40-minute drive, and he wore the jacket he'd bought for Margaret's funeral, and he sat in the second row of the gallery and watched Darla Campos operate in a courtroom for the first time. She had been right when she told him she knew she was the smartest person in the room. What she hadn't told him was that she made no effort to hide it, not from the judge, not from opposing counsel, not from the room. She made her arguments the way a good mechanic made a diagnosis following the evidence, without detour, naming each step, letting the logic carry the weight rather than the personality. Apex's attorney was polished and well-prepared, and had clearly spent the last 18 hours building the best possible case for denying the injunction. He was good. Ethan could tell he was good. Campos was better. The judge granted the injunction at 3:47. Gerald Shu's foreclosure proceeding was suspended pending the outcome of the broader case. The room was quiet for a moment after the ruling, and then there was the shuffling of papers and the movement of bodies and the particular sound of a courthouse gallery finding its way back to ordinary motion. Ethan sat very still. He thought about Gerald Shu out past Ash Fork, 78 years old, who didn't know yet that the thing he'd been facing for 3 days had just stopped, at least temporarily, because a retired mechanic outside Flagstaff had returned a lost wallet 4 days ago. He thought about that chain of events. He thought about how far the wallet had been from this courthouse in every sense. Campos found him in the hallway after. First round, she said, we have a lot more ahead. I know, Ethan said. Apex is going to come back harder, she said. Now that they know the injunction is granted, Cray isn't going to be the only one calling. They're going to look for ways to complicate your situation, your standing, your credibility. She watched him. I want to make sure you're prepared for that. What does that look like? Ethan asked. It could look like neighbors or acquaintances being contacted. It could look like someone looking into your background, your history. It could look like creative questions being raised about the condition of the property before Decker's crew worked on it. She said this plainly without drama, the way a doctor named what you might experience before a hard procedure. They will try to change the story. Ethan thought about that. What's the story they want to change? The one that's already starting to travel, Campos said. About you, about the wallet and what came after. She paused. Reyes told you that he thought this might draw attention. He was underestimating it. When we file the full complaint next week, it's going to be in the public record. Journalists look at public records, especially cases with this kind of human component. Ethan looked at her. I'm not interested in being a story, he said, for the second time in 4 days. I know, Campos said. Jackson told me you'd say that. Something moved across her face that might in different light have been the edge of a smile. But sometimes what you're interested in doesn't determine what happens. She left him there in the hallway. He drove home through the Flagstaff Desert in the late afternoon, the sun, at the angle that made every piece of scrub brush throw a long shadow east. And he thought about what Campos had said about the story starting to travel. He didn't like it. He'd spent his whole life doing things the way he believed they should be done without needing anyone to see it or mark it down. Margaret had known him. That had always been enough. The idea of being visible, of the mechanic logic of just do the right thing, becoming something public and discussable, felt wrong in a way he didn't fully have words for yet. He was still working through it when he got home and found a truck he didn't recognize parked in his drive. A man was sitting on his porch steps, somewhere in his mid-60s, with the weathered look of someone who'd spent decades working outside, wearing a jacket that was too warm for the afternoon, and holding a piece of paper that he turned over in his hands continuously without looking at it, the way people handled things when they were nervous. He stood up when Ethan's truck pulled in. "Mr. Carter," he said when Ethan climbed out. "That's me," Ethan said. "My name is Dennis Farrow," the man said. "I got a call this morning from someone named Reyes." He stopped, started again. "He told me about what's happening with Apex, about the case." He looked at Ethan with the expression of a man who had driven a long way with something complicated to say and was now running out of practiced language. "I'm one of them, one of the others." Ethan looked at him. "How far did you come?" "Chino Valley," Farrow said. "About an hour." "Come inside," Ethan said. "I'll put coffee on." Dennis Farrow sat at Ethan's kitchen table, the same table that had hosted Jackson Morgan and Reyes and Darla Campos, that had held the stacked envelopes and the wallet and the rubber-banded documents from Margaret's filing cabinet, and he told his story. He was 66, retired from the highway department after 31 years. His wife Connie was still working part-time at a pharmacy because the pension didn't quite cover everything. They'd had the Apex modification for 3 years. The amount they'd been paying had seemed high to him from the start, but the paperwork was complicated, and their original loan broker had explained it in a way that made it sound unavoidable, and so they'd paid it. He set the piece of paper down on the table. It was a payment history printed from an online account with numbers written in pencil in the margins. His own running calculation Ethan could see of what he thought he owed versus what Apex said he owed. "I've been doing this math for 8 months, Farrow said. "Every time I come up with a different number than they do, I go back and look at the paperwork again, and I can't find where my number goes wrong, but I also can't find where their number comes from." He looked at Ethan. "Reyes told me you had the same experience." "Almost exactly," Ethan said. Farrow looked at the payment history in front of him. 31 years I worked for the state, he said. "I know how systems work. I know that paperwork has a logic to it. And I kept looking at that paperwork thinking I'm missing something. I'm not smart enough to read this right." He stopped. "And the thing that gets me, the thing I keep coming back to, is that I almost believe them, that I was the one who had it wrong." Ethan understood that feeling in his bones. The specific corrosion of being made to feel incompetent by a system that was designed to be incomprehensible. The way it stripped a person of the confidence they'd spent a lifetime building. "You weren't wrong," Ethan said. "Your math was right. Their structure is illegal." Farrow looked at him and something in his face shifted, not dramatically, not with any kind of performance. Just a quiet recalibration, the way a man looked when something he'd suspected for a long time was confirmed as fact. Reyes said you are going forward with the full case, Farrow said. The public case. Yes, Ethan said, even though it would have been faster and easier to settle. Yes, Ethan said again. Farrow turned the payment history over in his hands one more time. Then he set it flat on the table and smoothed it out. I want to be part of it, he said, if you'll have me. Ethan called Reyes right there at the table with Farrow sitting across from him, and when Reyes answered, Ethan said, I've got someone here you need to talk to. He handed the phone to Dennis Farrow. While Farrow talked to Reyes, Ethan refilled both their coffees and stood at the kitchen counter and looked out the window at the desert. The shadows were long now, the day almost spent. In the last of the light, the scrub brush looked almost golden, the kind of deceptive beauty that the desert produced at the edges of day. He thought about the morning he'd found the wallet. He thought about the precise sequence, the decision at the highway's shoulder, the 40 minutes finding a phone number, the call, the 10 seconds of temptation, and the reason he'd moved past them, the photograph of Lily laughing on a motorcycle. He thought about Jackson arriving at his door and Reyes's voice on the phone late at night, and Campos in the courtroom that afternoon dismantling Apex's argument with the patience of someone who had done the harder work beforehand so that the public performance could look effortless. He thought about Margaret's sticky note on the rubber band, not just the ones you think you need, Ethan. He hadn't known when he crouched down on the highway's shoulder 4 mornings ago that he was picking up anything more than a lost wallet. But that was the thing about doing the right thing. It didn't announce what it was going to become. It just presented itself in the form of the next right action, and you either took it or you didn't, and if you did, you followed it to where it led. Farrow handed the phone back. He wants to talk to you. Ethan took it. Yeah. That's 5, Reyes said, and he meant 5 property owners now confirmed in the case. I need 2 more days to finish pulling records. I think there are at least 4 more. He paused. Darla's going to file the full complaint Monday. This is going to be bigger than what we talked about initially. How much bigger? Ethan asked. Reyes was quiet for a moment. The careful kind of quiet, the kind of pause a man used when he was about to say something he'd been holding back because he hadn't been sure of it yet. And now he was. There are cases like this, Reyes said slowly, that end up being about one lender's practice in one state. And there are cases that end up being about industry-wide practices that regulators have been looking for a thread to pull for years. He paused again. I've been in contact with someone at the Arizona Attorney General's office, not formally, just a conversation, but they're aware of what we're building. Ethan stood very still. Since when? He asked. Since yesterday afternoon, Reyes said, after the injunction filing. When you put something into the public record that has this kind of statutory specificity, certain offices pay attention. Ethan looked at Farrow sitting at his kitchen table, turning the payment history over in his hands again, waiting. What does that mean for the people in the case? Ethan asked. It means, Reyes said carefully, that if the AG's office decides to move on this independently, it significantly increases the pressure on Apex to settle the individual cases quickly and completely on terms favorable to the plaintiffs. It could actually speed up your resolution, not slow it down. He paused. But it also means it stops being something Ethan Carter controls. Ethan absorbed that. He thought about the thing he told Campos, about not wanting to be a story, about the specific discomfort of visibility, about having spent his whole life doing right things quietly and having that be enough. What does Darla say? He asked. She says it depends on you, Reyes said. If you want to keep this narrowly defined your case, the named plaintiffs, the 6 properties, she can build it that way, and it still wins. If you're willing to let it be what it might actually be, she needs to know that before Monday. Farrow looked up from his payment history and met Ethan's eyes across the kitchen. He didn't know what Reyes had just said, but something in Ethan's expression must have communicated the weight of it because Farrow set the paper down again and straightened slightly in his chair. What's happening? Farrow asked quietly. Ethan looked at this man he'd known for less than 2 hours. 66 years old, 31 years working for the state, a wife named Connie who still worked part-time because the pension didn't quite cover everything. 8 months of doing the math himself and being made to doubt his own arithmetic. Something bigger than I expected, Ethan said. He asked Reyes to hold. He put the phone face down on the table and looked at Farrow. He told him, plainly without inflating it, what Reyes had said about the AG's office, what it might mean for the case, what it might mean for the people in it. Farrow listened without moving. When Ethan finished, Farrow was quiet for a moment. My father lost his property in the 70s, Farrow said. Bad loan, predatory terms. He spent the rest of his life believing he'd made the mistake. He paused. He hadn't, but he died believing it. Ethan didn't say anything. Let it be what it is, Farrow said. Ethan picked up the phone. Tell Darla to build it the right way, he said to Reyes. After Farrow left, they shook hands on the porch, the kind of handshake that meant something beyond the social convention of it. Ethan went back inside and called Jackson. He told him everything. The injunction Campos in the courtroom craze call and how he'd handled it. Farrow showing up at the house. The conversation with Reyes about the AG's office. Jackson listened to all of it. Then he said, you know what this means. It means it got bigger, Ethan said. It means, Jackson said, that there is no version of this that stays quiet, not anymore. He paused. How do you feel about that? Ethan thought about it honestly, the way Margaret always required. 2 days ago, I would have said I didn't want it, he said. I still don't want the attention part. I never wanted that. He stopped. But there's a man named Gerald Shue who's 78 years old and he had an active foreclosure 3 days ago, and now he doesn't, and there are more people like him. And if making this big is what stops the next one from happening to someone else who doesn't have a Reyes or a Campos to call, he paused. Then I can live with being visible. Jackson was quiet on the line. You know what I keep thinking about, Jackson said finally. What? I keep thinking about the fact that it started with you finding something that wasn't yours, Jackson said, and deciding that mattered. That the distinction between yours and not yours mattered even when it cost you to maintain it. He paused. And that same instinct, the one that made you pick up that wallet and find a way to return it instead of just keeping it, that's the same instinct that's driving everything that's happening now. Ethan didn't answer right away. He thought about the 10 seconds on the highway's shoulder, the photograph of Lily, the 30 seconds it had taken him to make the decision. I just did what seemed right, Ethan said. I know, Jackson said. That's the whole point. He let that sit between them for a moment. Then Jackson said, in the flat practical register that meant he was about to shift to logistics, I'm going to make sure you're not doing this alone. The people who showed up at your house to fix the roof, they're available. Not for the legal work, but for whatever else needs doing, running people somewhere, making sure nobody's bothering you in ways they shouldn't. He paused. You're not going to want to hear this. Say it anyway, Ethan said. Apex has resources and they have reach, and they don't like losing, Jackson said. What Campos told you about them trying to change the story, she was being polite about it. They will push, and they will push in ways that a 72-year-old man living alone in a desert town without much support isn't necessarily set up to handle. Ethan sat with that. I'm not afraid of them, he said. I know you're not, Jackson said. I'm not asking you to be afraid. I'm telling you that you have backup whether you asked for it or not. The word backup landed in Ethan's chest in a way he hadn't expected. Not because it was complicated, because it was simple, and because the simple truth of it that there were people prepared to stand behind him was something he hadn't had outside of Margaret in longer than he could accurately remember. All right, he said. Get some sleep, Jackson said. Darla's going to call you in the morning to go over what the complaint looks like. I will, Ethan said. He didn't immediately. He sat at the table in the kitchen that had become something over the last 4 days. Not just his kitchen, but the place where something had started. He sat there and he thought about all of it, the chain of it, link by link, from the wallet, lying in the dust, by an abandoned gas station, all the way to an attorney in Phoenix building a complaint that might reach the Arizona Attorney General's office. He thought about what Reyes had said. I don't think you understand yet what it might turn into. He was starting to. He looked at Margaret's sticky note still sitting on the counter where he'd left it when he pulled the documents. Not just the ones you think you need, Ethan. She had written that about financial documents, but she might as well have been talking about all of it. He got up and turned off the kitchen light and went to bed. And for the first time in 3 years, the quiet in the house didn't feel like absence. It felt like something gathering, like the desert before a storm, that specific charged stillness that meant something was on its way, and that the question wasn't whether it was coming, but whether you were ready to stand in it. He thought he was. He closed his eyes. Outside, the Arizona night did what it always did, held its breath between the heat of the day in the cold of the small hours, and Ethan Carter lay in the dark and let himself believe for the first time in a long time that the morning was going to bring something worth waking up for. Darla Campos called at 7:22 in the morning, which told Ethan she'd been working since before 6. "I need you to know what's in the complaint before I file it," she said. "Not the legal language, you don't need to review the legal language, but the facts as I've stated them. Because once this is in the record, it's in the record." "Read it to me," Ethan said. She did. It took 11 minutes. She read it the way she argued clean sequential without inflation. The facts were the facts, and they were damning enough without decoration. Apex Lending had applied a compounding structure to mortgage modification agreements that was prohibited. Under Arizona statute, had done so systematically across at minimum 9 identified properties in Yavapai and Coconino counties, and had followed a documented pattern of escalating communication designed to pressure homeowners into either paying the inflated amounts or surrendering properties before the underlying fraud could be examined. 9 properties. They'd found 3 more overnight. "The 9 named plaintiffs," Campos said when she finished. "Gerald sued Dennis Farrow and 7 others, including you. The complaint names Apex Lending and Vincent Cray personally." "Cray personally," Ethan repeated. "He signed off on the modification template," Campos said. "His signature is on the standardized document that every one of these 9 modifications was built on. That's not accidental, that's authorization." She paused. "Are you comfortable with everything you heard?" "File it," Ethan said. She filed at 8:45. By 10 o'clock, Ethan's phone had rung 4 times from numbers he didn't recognize. He let them go to voicemail. He called Reyes, who told him to keep doing exactly that and to forward anything that came in writing to Campos's office immediately. At 10:37, a car he didn't recognize came slowly down his drive. Not a truck, not a motorcycle. A late-model sedan, clean with the anonymous quality of a rental. Ethan watched from the kitchen window as it slowed and then stopped without fully pulling in, sat there for almost 2 minutes, and then reversed back onto the road and left. He called Jackson. "White or silver sedan," Jackson said. Ethan thought, "Silver." "Don't worry about it," Jackson said. "We've already got someone on your road." Ethan processed that. "Since when?" "Since last night," Jackson said. "I told you, you have backup." The idea that someone from the Hells Angels had been sitting on the road outside his property through the night was something Ethan didn't know how to feel about, and decided after a moment to simply accept. This was not a moment for the particular pride that had governed most of his life. This was a moment for the other thing Margaret had tried to teach him, the harder thing, the one he'd never been as good at: receiving. At 11:15, Reyes called. His voice had the specific quality of someone who was working to maintain his professional register over something that wanted to break through it. "The Arizona Republic has the complaint," he said. Ethan set his coffee mug down. "How come public filing?" Reyes said. "It's been in the record since 8:45. A reporter named Sarah Chen covers financial fraud for the paper. She pulled it off the docket." He paused. "She wants to talk to you." "What does Darla say?" Ethan asked. "Darla says it's your call. She also says that if you decline, the story runs anyway. It runs as a consumer fraud case, heavy on the legal details, modest on the human element. If you talk, it runs as what it actually is." Ethan thought about what Campos had told him, about the story already traveling, about not being able to control it once it was in the public record. He thought about Dennis Farrow's father, who'd lost his property in the 70s and spent the rest of his life believing he had made the mistake. "What's Sarah Chen's number?" Ethan said. She answered on the second ring, which meant she'd been waiting. Young voice, mid-30s, Ethan thought, with a focused, careful quality that reminded him of Reyes, the kind of person who asked the question they actually wanted the answer to rather than the question they thought they were supposed to ask. "Mr. Carter," she said, "thank you for calling me back. Can I ask you something right off the bat?" "Go ahead," Ethan said. "Why didn't you keep the money?" He told her the same thing he told Jackson at the kitchen table 8 days ago. He told her about the photograph, about the laugh in it, about Margaret and the 10 seconds and the 30-second decision. He told it plainly without adding anything the way he'd told it the first time. When he finished, Sarah Chen was quiet for a moment. "That's it," she said. "That's the whole reason." "That's it," Ethan said. She asked about the case. He told her what he could and directed the legal specifics to Campos. She asked about the other plaintiffs, and he told her she'd need to contact them individually. She asked about the Hells Angels connection, and he paused on that one. Jackson Morgan is a friend, Ethan said carefully. He helped me connect with the right people when I needed them. The rest of this is about Apex Lending and what they did to 9 homeowners. But the way you connected with him, she said, is in the complaint, Ethan said. It's public record. You can read it. He could hear the sound of typing and then a pause as she apparently pulled it up. The wallet, she said. Yes, Ethan said. Another silence. When she spoke again, her voice had shifted very slightly, not less professional, but more real. Mr. Carter, I cover financial fraud, predatory lending specifically. I've been covering it for 6 years. She stopped. Can I tell you something? Sure, Ethan said. The cases we cover, the ones that actually change anything, they almost never start with the fraud. They start with a person. One specific person who did one specific thing that opened a door. She paused. You're that person in this case, you understand that, right? Ethan looked at the kitchen counter, at the spot where the envelopes used to be stacked, at Margaret's sticky note still sitting there, curling slightly at the corners now from the dry air. I understand it more than I did last week, he said. The story ran online at 3:47 that same afternoon. Campos sent him the link. He read it on his phone sitting at the kitchen table, and it was strange, genuinely strange, to read his own life described by someone else in a piece that had already been shared 400 times by the time he reached the end of it. Sarah Chen had written it the way he told it, plain, sequential, without inflation. The legal details were precise. The human element was the wallet and the photograph and the 10 seconds. 400 shares became 1,200 by dinner. His phone started ringing in earnest after that. He let everything go to voicemail and texted Reyes the count, and Reyes texted back, turn the ringer off and get some sleep. We have a hearing Thursday. He turned the ringer off. He did not get much sleep. What he did instead was lie in the dark and think about the hearing, Thursday, which was 3 days away, and what it meant that this had moved from his kitchen table to a Phoenix attorney's briefcase, to a public court filing to the Arizona Republic in 8 days. He thought about Gerald Shue, who Reyes had said had been contacted by Campos's office and had wept on the phone not from distress, but from relief, the specific physical release of a fear that had been held in the body for too long. He thought about the man named Raymond Okafor, one of the 9 plaintiffs, who was 63 years old, and had told Reyes he'd been sleeping 4 hours a night since the foreclosure notice arrived, and hadn't told his wife how bad it was because he didn't know how. He thought about all 9 of them spread across Yavapai and Coconino counties, all of them living in the same arithmetic that had been constructed to defeat them. He fell asleep somewhere around 2 in the morning and woke to his phone vibrating on the nightstand. He'd left it on silent, but vibration at 6:14. Jackson, he answered. You need to see something, Jackson said. Turn your ringer back on and check your email. Ethan found his glasses and opened his email on the phone. There were 67 unread messages. He scrolled past the unfamiliar addresses until he saw one from Campos, sent at 5:50 a.m. with the subject line, Apex Development. Call me when you're up. He called her. They want to settle, she said without preamble. All 9 cases. All 9 cases. Full principal correction, elimination of the fraudulent compounding amounts, reimbursement of overcharges, going back to the modification date. She paused. And they want a non-disclosure agreement. Ethan was immediately alert. No. I expected that, she said. Here's what they're proposing in exchange for the NDA. She named a figure, a dollar figure, a settlement amount for Ethan individually that was more money than he'd seen in a decade. He was quiet for a long time. Campos let him be quiet. What do the others say? He asked finally. I haven't told them the number yet, she said. I'm calling you first because you're the lead plaintiff and because I need to understand where you stand before I advise anyone else. She paused. I want to be honest with you, Ethan. Some of these people have been living under serious financial stress for months. Gerald Shue is 78. Raymond Okafor hasn't been sleeping. A settlement that makes them financially whole, even with an NDA, would be life-changing for them in ways that continuing the litigation won't be, at least not in the same time frame. Ethan heard what she wasn't saying as clearly as what she was, that the choice wasn't just about what was right in the abstract. It was about what was right for 8 specific people who hadn't asked for any of this and who needed relief faster than principle could deliver it. What happens to the practice if we settle with an NDA? He asked. What happens to the next Gerald Shue? Campos was quiet. That's the question, she said. Answer it for me. If we settle with an NDA, she said carefully, the fraudulent structure stays out of the public record. Apex restructures, they have to. They can't risk this again now that Reyes has documented it. But there's no public precedent, no AG involvement, no regulatory pressure. They potentially move the structure to another state. She paused. If we reject the NDA and go forward, the timeline extends. The other plaintiffs wait longer for resolution. But the documentation becomes public record. The AG's office has what they need to move, and Apex doesn't have anywhere to hide it. Ethan sat on the edge of his bed. He thought about what Jackson had said, about the instinct that had made him pick up the wallet and return it, about the distinction between what was his and what wasn't, about the fact that that same instinct was what was driving everything that had happened since. Can we split it? He asked. Campos didn't answer immediately. Explain what you mean, she said. Can we accept the financial correction for the 9 plaintiffs, the overcharges repaid, the mortgage amounts corrected, but refuse the NDA? Is that a negotiating position? Silence. It's a negotiating position, Campos said slowly. It's not one they proposed. It's not one they're expecting. She paused, and Ethan could hear her thinking. It essentially tells them we'll take the money, but we won't be quiet, which means they pay out the settlement and still face the regulatory exposure. Yes, Ethan said. They'll say no, Campos said. Then we go to Thursday, Ethan said. They may say no and then come back, she said. Or they may not. I want you to understand that. I understand, Ethan said. Talk to the other plaintiffs. Tell them what the NDA offer is. Tell them I'm rejecting the NDA condition, but that it's their choice individually. He stopped. This started because I made a decision about what belonged to me and what didn't. Gerald Shue and Dennis Farrow and Raymond Okafor, they get to make that decision for themselves. I'm not going to make it for them. Another silence, longer than the previous ones. All right, Campos said. I'll make the calls. He got up and made coffee and stood at the kitchen counter while the coffee brewed and thought about whether he just made the right call or the stubborn one, and whether in this particular situation there was a difference. His phone buzzed, a text from a number he didn't recognize. He almost ignored it. Then he read it. Mr. Carter, my name is Gerald Shue. Darla just called me. I wanted to hear your voice before I decided anything. Can you call me? Ethan called him immediately. Gerald Shue's voice was older than Ethan expected, not in a diminished way, but in the way of a man who had accumulated a great deal of life and was carrying most of it with him at any given moment. He spoke carefully, choosing his words. She told me about the NDA, Gerald said. Yes, Ethan said. She told me what you said, that it was our choice individually. It is, Ethan said. Gerald was quiet for a moment. I'm 78, he said. I don't have a lot of runway left for principals that take years to pay out. I know, Ethan said. But I've been on that property for 31 years, Gerald said. I built a workshop back behind the house. My son and I built it the summer before he moved to Oregon. He's in Oregon still doing fine. He paused. I don't need that property for the money it represents. I need it because it's the last place where all the things that matter to me are still in one location. Ethan didn't say anything. He understood. If we sign the NDA, Gerald said, and they do this to someone else somewhere else, someone else like me, someone who built something over 30 years and had it threatened by people who bet they were too old or too isolated to fight back. He stopped. I don't want to be the reason that it keeps happening. Ethan felt something move through his chest, quiet and certain. You don't have to decide anything right now, Ethan said. I already decided, Gerald said. I called you because I wanted to say it to the person who started this, not to Darla, to you. He paused. No NDA. After he hung up, Ethan sat at the table with his coffee and thought that the world was full of Gerald Shues and Dennis Farrows and Raymond Okafors, and that most of them were invisible to the systems that made decisions about their lives, and that invisibility was precisely what those systems relied on. Campos called back at 11:40. 7 no ND as, she said. 2 who want to take the full settlement, including the NDA. That's their right, Ethan said. Yes, she said. I'm presenting Apex with the split 7 plaintiffs. Reject the NDA Condition 2, accept the full settlement. What we're offering is corrected mortgage amounts and overcharge reimbursement for all 9 NDA for 2, no NDA for 7. She paused. Apex is going to call this unprecedented. Is it? Ethan said. In my experience, she said yes. Do it anyway, Ethan said. She did. Apex response came back in 2 hours and 40 minutes, which was faster than Ethan expected, which meant something about the pressure they were feeling. The response was a counter they would accept the split ND, a structure for a reduced settlement figure. They were cutting the overcharge reimbursement by 20%. Ethan read the counter when Campos forwarded it. He called her back. Tell them no, he said. Full overcharge reimbursement. Or we go to Thursday. They're testing you, she said. I know, he said. Tell them no. He was standing at the kitchen counter, waiting for Campos to call back when a knock came at the front door. He opened it. It was Decker. He was holding 2 brown paper bags that smelled like food, and he had the expression of a man who had been given an assignment and was executing it without drama. Jackson figured you hadn't eaten, Decker said. Ethan looked at him for a moment. Come in, he said. Decker had brought enough food for 4 people, which was either a miscalculation or a statement. He spread it on the kitchen table while Ethan cleared space, and they ate 2 men who had known each other for less than 2 weeks and talked in the practical, unembellished way of men who communicated best through the act of doing rather than the act of declaring. Decker told him about the roof repair, about what had needed replacing and what had been salvageable, and the specific type of seal he'd used for the Arizona sun exposure and why. Ethan told him about the counter from Apex. Decker ate for a moment. What happens if they don't come back before Thursday? We go in front of the judge Thursday, Ethan said. Is that bad? For them, Ethan said. Decker nodded once. Then they'll come back. Campos called at 3:18. They accepted, she said. Ethan set his coffee down. All terms, full reimbursement, split NDA. Full reimbursement, split NDA, and she paused, and the pause had something in it. Ethan hadn't heard from her before, a quality that was almost like satisfaction, but more controlled than that. They've agreed to a compliance audit of their full Arizona modification portfolio, conducted by an independent firm with results filed in the public record. Ethan was completely still. The audit was your idea, he asked. It was something I added to the final round, she said. They were already softened by the NDA split. The audit was the thing I'd been holding back. A pause. The results of that audit are going to be available to the AG's office, to every plaintiff's attorney in the state, and to journalists like Sarah Chen. So the NDA doesn't matter, Ethan said slowly, because the audit makes the practice visible anyway. Correct, Campos said. The 2 plaintiffs who signed NDAs about their specific cases are protected. But the pattern, the systematic fraud across the portfolio that goes on record through the audit. Apex's legal team either didn't understand that implication or decided the audit was preferable to the Thursday hearing. I think it was the latter. Ethan thought about Sarah Chen's piece and the 1,200 shares by dinner and the 67 emails and the silver car that had come slowly down his drive and reversed back out. Darla, he said. Yes. That was extraordinary, he said. A brief silence. It was a team effort, she said. And the way she said it was different from deflection. It was acknowledgement. She meant Reyes and the 9 plaintiffs and the Hells Angels members who documented the roof violations to support the case. And Ethan understood herself. We'll have signing documents by end of week. The audit firm starts Monday. She paused. And Ethan, you should know that Reyes contacted the AG's office this morning, not about the settlement, but about the audit requirement. They're watching. After he hung up, Decker was looking at him. It's over, Decker said. This part is, Ethan said. He called Jackson. When Jackson answered, Ethan said, it's settled. Full reimbursement, public audit, no NDA for 7 of 9 plaintiffs. Jackson said nothing for a long moment. The audit, Jackson said. Campos added it at the end, Ethan said. It puts everything in the public record without the individual cases being exposed. She's good, Jackson said. She's excellent, Ethan said. Another pause. How do you feel? Ethan thought about it honestly. He thought about the specific architecture of the feeling, The relief which was real but smaller than he'd expected, and the other thing underneath it, the thing that didn't have a clean name, the feeling of something having been completed that was larger than the parts he could identify. I feel like something Margaret would have called rightness, he said. That specific thing where you're not sure how you knew what the right thing was, but you know you did it. Jackson was quiet for long enough that Ethan checked the call hadn't dropped. I want to tell you something, Jackson said. Go ahead. I've had a lot of people in my life over 40 years, Jackson said. A lot of situations, a lot of moments where I had to make a judgment call about what kind of person I was dealing with. He stopped. When I drove to your house to pick up that wallet, I thought I was doing the efficient thing, just handling it myself instead of sending someone. Another pause. I didn't expect to meet you. I didn't expect to meet you either, Ethan said. What I mean is, Jackson paused again, and Ethan recognized the quality of the pause now. The one where Jackson Morgan, who commanded a room by nature and spoke with the authority of decades, was navigating something that was more vulnerable than he was entirely comfortable with. After Lily died, I closed off. I stopped letting things matter the way they used to. I kept the club running. I kept the obligations. I kept moving. But I stopped letting anything get through. He stopped. That photograph in the wallet, the fact that you saw it and you protected it and you called me, that started something moving again, that I didn't know was still capable of moving. Ethan sat at his kitchen table in the silence that followed. He thought about the photograph of Lily with her head thrown back in that unguarded laugh. He thought about the morning light on the highway shoulder. He thought about 30 seconds. She'd be proud of you, Ethan said quietly, not for the club or the reputation, for the way you moved when it mattered. The silence on the line lasted a long time. When Jackson spoke again, his voice was the same flat controlled register it always was, but something underneath it was different, looser, like something had been set down. Friday night, he said, my place, I want to introduce you to some people, the people who've been part of this. The Hells Angles, Ethan said. My family, Jackson said. There's a difference. Ethan thought about that, about all the things he'd assumed about leather jackets and motorcycle clubs and the men who moved in Jackson Morgan's orbit before he'd stood in that orbit himself and seen what it actually looked like from the inside. All right, he said, Friday. He ended the call and sat at the table. Decker had cleaned up the food containers without being asked and was leaning against the counter with his own coffee, looking at something on his phone with the comfortable, settled quality of a man who was exactly where he was supposed to be. You got somewhere to be? Ethan asked. Decker looked up. Not particularly. Then stay a while, Ethan said. Decker stayed another 2 hours. They talked about engines. Ethan's 40 years of diagnostics and Decker's own working knowledge, which was more extensive than Ethan had expected. The kind of practical depth that came from maintaining a fleet of motorcycles across 40 years of hard riding in Arizona weather. They found in the language of mechanical systems a version of each other they recognized easily. Men who understood that things worked because of careful attention to the relationship between their parts, and that things failed for the same reason. After Decker left, Ethan called Reyes. Reyes had already heard from Campos. He was restrained the way he was always restrained, but something was moving underneath it. The audit, Reyes said. I know, Ethan said. When the results come in, and this is going to take some months, but when they come in, if the pattern holds across the full portfolio the way we think it does. He stopped. This doesn't end with 9 properties, Ethan. This ends with regulatory action at the state level at minimum. I know, Ethan said again. Does that? Reyes started. Yes, Ethan said before he could finish the question. That's what it was supposed to do. A brief pause. Then Reyes said something he'd clearly been working up to. Can I ask you something personal? Sure, Ethan said. When you found the wallet, Reyes said, in those first 10 seconds, were you tempted? Like actually tempted? Not just not the polite answer, the real one. Ethan thought about it honestly, the way he'd been thinking about everything honestly since this started. Yes, he said, genuinely. For about 10 seconds, I was tempted in a way that felt real, not just a passing thought, a real pull. He paused. And then I looked at the photograph, and it stopped being about the money. What made it stop? Reyes asked. Because I recognized what I was looking at, Ethan said. I recognized that it was someone's most important thing, and I thought if someone found the most important thing I have, I'd want them to see it for what it was. Reyes was quiet. What's your most important thing? He asked. Ethan looked at the counter, at the sticky note in Margaret's handwriting. She's gone, he said, but her instructions are still here, and I'm still following them. The line was quiet for a long moment. Ethan, Reyes said, it has been it has been a privilege to work on this case. It's been a privilege having someone to work on it with, Ethan said. After he hung up, the house was quiet in the way it was usually quiet. The same desert air, the same tick of the afternoon heat against the walls, the same particular quality of alone that had lived in the house for 3 years. But something was different about it today, and Ethan sat with it for a moment before he identified what it was. The quiet wasn't heavy anymore. It was the quiet of a man who had done a great deal in a short time and had earned the silence, who had people he trusted on the other end of a phone, who had a standing dinner invitation for Friday at a place that was already starting to feel like something he was allowed to call his community, who had a sticky note from his wife that he was still following one decision at a time. He got up. He walked to the back room and opened Margaret's filing cabinet and found a fresh folder from the stack she'd always kept in the back. He labeled it in his own handwriting, not her careful print, but his working mechanic's shorthand. He wrote Apex case resolved. He put Campos' settlement summary inside and Reyes' first analysis and Sarah Chen's article printed from his phone. He put the copy of the injunction in the complaint and the signed authorization he had sent to Reyes on day one. He held the folder for a moment. Then he put it in the drawer under Margaret's organized categories in the drawer she'd labeled important. He closed the cabinet. He went to make dinner, a real dinner, not the sandwich over the sink kind, and the sound of the kitchen filling with the ordinary sounds of cooking had a different quality than it usually did, fuller somehow. Like the house was agreeing with him about something. Outside, the desert was starting its evening routine. The heat was beginning to release. Somewhere down the road, a Hells Angels member was sitting in a parked truck doing a job that nobody had asked him to do because Jackson Morgan had said Ethan Carter had backup, and in that community, backup was not a metaphor. Ethan stood at the stove and thought about Friday, about walking into a room full of people he hadn't known 2 weeks ago and finding somehow that they'd become part of the fabric of his life. He thought about what Jackson had said. My family, there's a difference. He thought about what family meant at 72 after Margaret, after the quiet years after the envelopes and the highway walks and the coffee can on the counter. He thought about what it meant to have it arrive from the direction he'd least expected, wearing leather and riding motorcycles and speaking in the flat, practical language of loyalty. He thought that Margaret, who had believed the world was more interconnected than people gave it credit for, who had always insisted that kindness moved in ways you couldn't predict or control, would have found all of this exactly as expected. She would have looked at him over her coffee mug and said, well, you picked up the wallet, didn't you? He would have said yes. And she would have said, then this is just the rest of that. He stirred what was on the stove and let that thought settle into him completely. The rest of that. All of it. Gerald Chu's relief. Dennis Farrow's vindication. Raymond Okafor sleeping through the night for the first time in months. The public audit that would take Apex's hidden practice and put it where anyone could read it, the case that Reyes believed would become something the state. AG's office acted on. Jackson Morgan, sitting at his kitchen table, was talking about his daughter. All of it was the rest of that. The rest of 30 seconds on a highway shoulder. The rest of a wallet returned. The rest of a decision made because a photograph showed someone laughing the way Margaret used to laugh, and that had been enough. He finished making dinner and sat down at the kitchen table and ate it, and it was the best meal he'd had in 3 years, and not because of what was in it. Friday arrived the way important days sometimes did, quietly without announcing itself. Just another Arizona morning with the same dry air and the same light coming through the same kitchen window, except that Ethan had been awake since 5 and had already made and finished a pot of coffee by the time the sun was fully up. He dressed carefully. Not formally, he didn't own formal, and the Hells Angels clubhouse was not a place that required it, but carefully in the way he'd always dressed for things that mattered. Clean jeans, the flannel shirt Margaret had given him for his 68th birthday that he'd been saving without knowing for what. His good boots, which were not impressive boots by any external measure, but were the boots he'd worn to every significant event of the last decade. He looked at himself in the bathroom mirror for a moment. 72 years old, gray hair, worn face, the kind of hands that told the story of a working life without needing words. He looked exactly like what he was, and he'd stopped apologizing for that a long time ago. He drove to the clubhouse. He'd been there before, the day he'd returned. The wallet felt simultaneously like yesterday and like something that had happened in a previous chapter of his life, which in a meaningful sense it had. But arriving this time was different. The last time he'd come as a stranger carrying something that belonged to someone else. This time he was arriving as himself, which was both simpler and more complicated. There were more motorcycles in the yard than the first time. More trucks. The sound coming from inside was the sound of people who were comfortable with each other. Low overlapping conversation, laughter at irregular intervals. The specific ambient noise of a group that didn't need to perform anything for one another. Decker met him at the door. "You made it," Decker said, and there was something in the way he said it. Not surprise, but satisfaction. The satisfaction of a man who'd been hoping for something and was glad to see it arrive. "I said I would," Ethan said. Inside, the room was full. Ethan had expected to feel the same quality of watchfulness he'd felt on his first visit. The eyes, the assessment, the particular weight of a room full of people who were deciding what they thought of you. But the watchfulness this time had a different character. It wasn't evaluating him. It had already evaluated him, had reached a conclusion, and what he was feeling now was something closer to the warmth of an already made decision. Men he didn't know came and introduced themselves, not all at once, in the gradual, organic way of people at a gathering who were working their way towards someone they'd wanted to meet. Some of them had been part of the roof crew. Some of them he recognized from the morning after the settlement when 3 Hells Angels members had shown up at his door without explanation and helped him carry Margaret's filing cabinet from the back room to a better location in the hallway. Because Decker had mentioned it was in an awkward spot, and apparently that was the kind of information that traveled. A man named Vic, somewhere in his 60s, with a working life written on his face the same way it was written on Ethan's, shook his hand and said, "My brother-in-law had a Chevy 350. He couldn't get running right for 3 years. Decker said you know engines. Think you could take a look sometime?" "Sure," Ethan said. "What's it doing?" They talked about the engine for 10 minutes, which was the best 10 minutes Ethan had spent at a social event in years, possibly decades. Jackson found him after that. He came across the room without urgency, and the men who were between him and Ethan moved aside not from any instruction, but from the habitual spatial awareness of people who'd been moving around Jackson Morgan long enough that it had become reflexive. He shook Ethan's hand and held it for a moment, not the performative grip of a man demonstrating strength, but the grip of someone who was communicating something that didn't have a verbal equivalent. "Glad you're here," Jackson said. "Glad to be here," Ethan said, and meant it in a way that surprised him slightly, the way honest statements sometimes did. They found a quieter corner of the room, not isolated, just removed from the densest part of the conversation, and stood there with their drinks, the way 2 men who had done a great deal together in a short time sometimes needed to simply be in the same space without the pressure of the next thing to navigate. "Reyes called me this morning," Jackson said. "What did he say?" "The audit firm started Monday," Jackson said. "He's already gotten a preliminary look at the scope. He thinks they're going to find the same compounding structure in more than 40 Arizona modifications." He paused. 40. Ethan absorbed that number. He'd known it was going to be larger than 9. He hadn't quite calibrated for 40. "What happens when the audit report is filed?" he asked. "The AG's office moves," Jackson said. "Reyes is confident. He said he's been in contact with someone there who was very specific about the word confident." He looked at Ethan steadily. "This becomes a state regulatory action, not just a civil case. Apex is going to face consequences that go beyond reimbursing 9 homeowners." Ethan thought about that, about what it meant, about the shape of it. One wallet, one decision, one chain of events that had gone from a highway shoulder outside Flagstaff to the Arizona Attorney General's office in less than 3 weeks. "You're thinking about Margaret," Jackson said. Ethan looked at him. "How do you know that?" "Because you get a specific look," Jackson said simply, "when you're thinking about her. I've only known you 2 weeks, but it's not a subtle look." Ethan thought about that for a moment, about being known, the specific experience of someone else having paid enough attention to read you accurately. He hadn't had that in 3 years. "I was thinking about what she would say," Ethan said. "What would she say?" He thought about it honestly. "She'd probably say she told me so." He paused, and she'd say it kindly enough that I wouldn't be able to argue. Jackson made a sound that was the closest thing to a laugh Ethan had heard from him. Brief and unguarded and real. Lily was like that too, Jackson said. I know, Ethan said. You told me. I keep telling you things about her, Jackson said. It wasn't quite a question. I don't mind, Ethan said. Keep going. Another brief silence. Then Jackson said, she wanted to be a lawyer. Did I tell you that? No. She was pre-law when she died, junior year. He looked at his drink. Sometimes I think about her watching what Campos and Reyes did this week, what you started. He stopped. She would have had opinions about all of it, very detailed, very specific opinions. She sounds like she would have been formidable, Ethan said. She was already formidable, Jackson said quietly, at 25. They were quiet for a moment, the comfortable kind, the kind that didn't need to be filled. Then Jackson said, I want to show you something, after tonight, I mean, not right now. What is it? Ethan said. A project, Jackson said. Something we've been building for a few years that hasn't had the right shape to it yet, the right framework. He looked at Ethan. I think it does now. Ethan waited. After Lily died, Jackson said, I needed to do something with it. The grief, I mean, I couldn't just carry it. He paused. The club has been building a community legal fund, small, local, aimed at exactly the kind of situation you were in, elderly homeowners, rural properties, people who have assets that need protecting, but no access to the legal resources to protect them. He paused again. We've had the money. We've had the will. We've never had a structure or a credibility that let us use it effectively, because anything associated with the Hells Angles, any good thing gets filtered through the reputation before it gets evaluated on its own merits. Ethan was listening very carefully. What happened in the last 2 weeks, Jackson said, is a structure, a demonstrated, documented, legally successful structure. Reyes and Campos and 9 plaintiffs and a retired mechanic from Flagstaff who returned a wallet and decided not to stop there. He looked at Ethan. That story, the one Sarah Chen wrote, the one that's been shared 40,000 times as of this morning, that story isn't about the Hells Angles. It's about a person making a right decision and what came from it. And that story is attached to a legal process that is now public record. 40,000 times, Ethan had stopped tracking the article shares after the first day. What are you asking me? Ethan said. I'm not asking you anything tonight, Jackson said. I'm telling you there's something to look at when you're ready, something that might take what happened here and let it happen again, for other people in the same situation. He paused. I want to name the fund after Lily. The room around them was full of sound and motion and the warmth of a community in its natural element, and in the middle of all of it, in their quiet corner, something settled between the two men that didn't need to be named to be understood. Tell me more about the project, Ethan said, when you're ready to show me. Monday, Jackson said. Monday? Ethan agreed. Ethan. The evening continued. Ethan ate food someone had made, someone in the club could cook, genuinely cook, and had produced something involving brisket that Ethan would think about for several days afterward and talk to people he hadn't met before and felt the particular ease of a community that had already decided to include him, which made everything simple in a way that social situations rarely were. At one point in the evening, a younger member, maybe 30, named Cole, came and sat beside him and said, Can I ask you something? Says, Sure, Ethan said. When you found the wallet, Cole said and stopped. Started again. I've been thinking about it all week because I don't know. I'd like to think I would have done the same thing. But I'm not sure I would have. He looked at Ethan directly. How did you know? How did you know that was the right call? Ethan thought about it. He'd been asked this question in various forms for 2 weeks, by Reyes and by Jackson and by Sarah Chen, and now by this 30-year-old man who was trying to calibrate something important about himself. I didn't know it was the right call, Ethan said. I knew it was the obvious call. Those aren't the same thing. He paused. Knowing right from obvious is something you develop over time. In my experience, it mostly develops from having someone in your life who holds you to a standard when you're not paying attention. Your wife, Cole said. Oh, my wife, Ethan said. For 43 years. Cole sat with that for a moment. What if you don't have that? Ethan looked at him, at the room around them, at the particular quality of belonging that filled every corner of the clubhouse on a Friday night. Find your people, Ethan said. and then let them hold you to it. Cole nodded, not the polite nod of someone acknowledging something they hadn't fully heard, the nod of someone filing something away carefully. He left, and Ethan sat alone for a moment with his drink, and he thought about what he just said and recognized it as something Margaret would have said in almost exactly those words, and felt the specific pleasure of having absorbed something from someone you loved well enough that it came out of you sounding like them. He was still sitting with that when his phone buzzed, a text from a number he now recognized as Gerald Shue's. The documents came today, the correction to the mortgage. The reimbursement is processing. A pause, then another message arriving immediately after. I went out to the workshop. First time in 3 months. It's still there, same as I left it. Thank you, Mr. Carter. Ethan read it twice. He thought about Gerald Shue at 78 walking out to the workshop he'd built with his son the summer before his son moved to Oregon. The first time in 3 months, because for 3 months it had been possible that the property wouldn't be his much longer, and proximity to something you might lose is its own kind of pain. He texted back, I'm glad it's still there. Take care of it. 3 minutes later, Gerald's reply, I will. I'm going to start a project I've been putting off. Figure I've got time now. Ethan put his phone away and found that his eyes were doing something he hadn't expected them to do in a room full of people, and he sat very still for a moment until they stopped. He looked up and found Jackson watching him from across the room. Jackson raised his chin slightly, the smallest possible gesture. The question it contained entirely readable, and Ethan shook his head just as slightly. I'm fine. Jackson nodded and turned back to whoever he had been talking to, and the efficiency of that exchange, two men communicating completely without performance, felt like another form of the belonging Ethan had been noticing all evening. He stayed until 10. When he said he was leaving, the departures were genuine men who shook his hand and meant it, who said, see you Monday, or I'll call about that engine, or simply good night, Ethan, in the way you said it to someone you expected to see again and weren't going to be formal about. Decker walked him to his truck. At the door, Decker said, first time I saw Jackson talk to someone, the way he talks to you, it was Lily. He had a different way of listening when she was in the room. He paused, not uncomfortable with what he'd said, but giving Ethan time to receive it. He doesn't do that with people. Ethan didn't answer right away. He held his keys and thought about what it meant to be the person someone listened to differently. I know, Ethan said finally. I'll take care of that. Decker nodded. We know you will, he said and went back inside. Ethan drove home through the desert dark, which was the most complete dark he knew. No other kind of dark had that quality of depth, that sense of the sky being genuinely close overhead. And he thought about Monday and the project, and Lily's name on a fund that would do what Reyes and Campos had done for 9 people, again, and again for whoever needed it next. He pulled into his drive and sat in his truck for a moment before getting out. His house was the same house it had always been, the same small structure in the same desert, the roof newly repaired, the faucet no longer dripping, the filing cabinet in the hallway with Margaret's categories, and a new folder in the drawer marked important. He went inside. He made a cup of tea, not coffee. He'd had enough coffee today and sat at the kitchen table and thought about the 2 weeks that had just happened in his life, the precise sequence of them, the way each piece had followed from the last in a chain that he still couldn't have predicted from any single link of it. He thought about the morning on the highway shoulder. He thought about the 10 seconds. He thought about the 30 seconds after the 10 seconds and the decision that had come out of them. He thought about what Cole had asked him. How did you know? He hadn't told Cole the whole answer. The whole answer was that the knowledge hadn't come from him. It had come from 43 years of being held to a standard by a woman who believed that character was what you were when you had every possible reason to be something else. Margaret hadn't built his integrity. She had witnessed it and named it and refused to let him be less than it, which had produced the same result more reliably than building it from scratch would have. He looked at the sticky note on the counter. Not just the ones you think you need, Ethan. He got up and picked it up carefully. The corners were curled now, the adhesive barely holding after 2 weeks of dry desert air. He carried it to the back room and opened Margaret's filing cabinet and found the drawer she'd labeled important and tucked the note inside the new folder between the settlement summary and Sarah Chen's article. He closed the drawer. He stood there in the back room, his hands still on the cabinet, and he talked to her. Not out loud, he'd never been one for out loud. But in the internal register he'd been using for 3 years, The ongoing conversation that didn't require her physical presence to feel real, because 43 years of talking to someone created a channel that didn't close just because they were gone. He told her about Gerald Shue in his workshop, about Dennis Farrow and the payment history he'd been doing in the margins for 8 months, about Darla Campos in a courtroom being the smartest person in the room and not pretending otherwise, about Reyes saying it has been a privilege, about Cole asking how you knew. He told her about Jackson, about a man who had spent 6 years closed off from the things that used to matter, carrying a photograph loose in his wallet because he needed to be able to touch it, and how something had started moving again when a stranger on a highway shoulder had seen what that photograph actually was and protected it. He told her what Jackson had said about Lily, that she'd wanted to be a lawyer, that she was already formidable at 25, that her name was going to go on something that helped people who couldn't help themselves, which was exactly the kind of thing a formidable 25-year-old who wanted to be a lawyer would have wanted her name on. He stood there for a long time. Then he said, still in that internal register, but more deliberately than usual, more directed, you told me, you always told me, that the character was what you were when you had every reason to be something else. I had every reason to keep that wallet, every practical, pressing, immediate reason in the world. He paused. I think you knew not about the wallet specifically, you couldn't have known that, but you knew that the moment would come. They always come. And you spent 43 years making sure I was the person I needed to be for it. He closed the filing cabinet. He went to bed. Monday morning came with the same dry air and the same light through the same kitchen window, and Ethan Carter made his coffee and drank it, standing at the counter the way he always did, looking at the space where the sticky note used to be, which was just a counter now, which was fine. His phone rang at 8:15. Sarah Chen. I hope it's not too early, she said. I've been up since 5:30, Ethan said. Right. He could hear her smiling. I'm calling because I got a call from a woman in Tucson yesterday. She read the article. She has an Apex modification. A pause. And I got a call from someone at the Tribune in Phoenix who wants to do a follow-up piece. And I got a call from, this is the one I actually wanted to tell you about, a woman named Patricia Yee who runs a nonprofit in Maricopa County that does housing counseling for elderly homeowners. She wants to talk to you. Ethan held his phone and looked at the kitchen, at the clean counter, at the filing cabinet just visible down the hallway, at the door that no longer stuck. What does Patricia Yee want? Ethan said. She wants to build something, Sarah Chen said. She says she's been trying to build it for 3 years and she couldn't figure out the model that worked. She read your story and she said, and I'm quoting, she said, that's the model. That's exactly what we've been missing. Ethan absorbed that. He thought about what Jackson had told him Friday night, about the fund, about Lily's name, about the structure that had been missing. He thought about Monday. Can you send me her number? He said. Already sent, Sarah Chen said. And Ethan. She stopped. What? He said. I've been covering financial fraud for 6 years, she said. I've written a lot of stories. Some of them changed things, and some of them just documented things that were already happening and didn't change anything. She paused. I think this one is going to change something. I think it already has. I wanted to say that to you directly. He thanked her and hung up. He called Jackson. Patricia Yee, he said when Jackson answered. I know who she is, Jackson said, and his voice had the quality of a man who had been doing his own thinking since Friday. Reyes mentioned her last night. I was going to call you about it this morning. What do you know about her? Ethan said. I know she's been doing good work in Maricopa for 3 years with not enough resources, Jackson said. I know she has the nonprofit structure and the community relationships in the model of what needs to happen. She just hasn't had a demonstrated legal success to build from. A pause. Until now. Ethan sat down at the kitchen table. Jackson, he said, yeah. What you said Friday about the fund, about naming it after Lily. A brief silence. What about it? Jackson said, but his voice was careful now, in a way that was different from his usual, careful. This was the careful of something that mattered being approached. I think it's right, Ethan said. I think the name is right. And I think if we're going to build this the way it deserves to be built, the fund, the framework, the connection to Patricia Yee and to Campos and Reyes. He paused. I think we should build it so that Lily's name is on something that lasts. Not just a fund, something that operates, something that people call when they need it and find it there. The silence on the line lasted longer than any other silence in 2 weeks of conversations. When Jackson spoke, his voice was exactly the same as it always was, flat, controlled, the decades of authority under every word. But underneath it, in the register that Ethan had learned to hear over the last 2 weeks, something was moving that was not controlled at all. "I've been thinking about that since Friday," Jackson said. "So have I," Ethan said. "Lily would have—" Jackson started and stopped. "I know," Ethan said. Another silence, the comfortable kind. "Monday still works," Jackson said. "I'm ready now," Ethan said. He arrived at the clubhouse 40 minutes later. Jackson was already at the table in the back room he used as an office, a practical, well-organized space that communicated like everything about Jackson Morgan, that the substance mattered and the presentation was secondary. Reyes was there by phone on a laptop Campos had called in, and a woman Ethan didn't recognize, who Jackson introduced as Sonia, the club's financial manager for 12 years, was sitting with a legal pad already half filled with notes. They worked for 4 hours. Not on one thing, but on everything simultaneously: the legal structure of the fund, the partnership with Patricia Yee's nonprofit, the intake model for new cases, the criteria for which homeowners qualified for the legal support, the funding mechanism that would keep it independent of any single source. Campos talked about the regulatory model. Reyes talked about the documentation standards that would make each case as airtight as Ethan's had been. Sonia ran numbers and interrupted when the numbers didn't support what was being proposed, and didn't apologize for interrupting. Ethan sat at the table and contributed what he knew, which was not the legal or financial architecture, but the human thing, the experience of being the person on the other end of the situation. What it felt like to have a stack of envelopes you stopped opening. What it cost to believe the number was your mistake. What it took for a man like Dennis Farrow to drive an hour to a stranger's house and say, "I want to be part of it." At one point, Campos said, "We need to know what the first call feels like, from the homeowner's perspective, when they pick up the phone to call the fund." Everyone looked at Ethan. "It feels like admitting you need help," he said, "which is the hardest call most people that age will ever make, because they've spent their whole lives being the person who didn't need to ask." He paused. "The call needs to feel like calling a neighbor. Not a legal office, not a charity, a neighbor who happened to know the right people." Sonia wrote that down verbatim. By the time they broke, Reyes signing off, Campos leaving for another meeting, Sonia gathering her legal pad, the shape of something real had emerged from the 4 hours. Not finished, not yet operational, but real in the way that things were real when the right people had put their hands on them and understood what they were building and why. Jackson walked Ethan out to his truck. The afternoon was at its hottest, the Arizona sun doing what it did in the hours before it started to decline. Ethan didn't mind it. He'd never minded the heat. "What are you going to call it?" Ethan asked. "The organization, the formal name." Jackson had been thinking about this, Ethan could tell. He had the look of a man who'd arrived at a decision and was presenting it rather than proposing it. "The Lily Morgan Housing Initiative," Jackson said. "Lily M. Morgan. She used her middle name at school because she said it sounded like someone who could walk into a room and not be underestimated." He paused. "Which was exactly what she did anyway, with or without the name." Ethan looked at him. "Perfect," he said. Jackson looked at the ground for a moment, and then back at Ethan with the directness that was his fundamental mode of communication. "You know what the thing is," Jackson said, "the thing I keep coming back to." "What?" "You didn't know me," Jackson said. "When you found that wallet, you had the license. You had enough information to know who I was and what I was connected to. You could have dropped it back on the ground, or turned it in somewhere and let someone else make the call." He paused. "You chose to call me directly." Why? Ethan thought about that. He hadn't been asked that specific question before. "Because it was yours," he said finally. "Whatever else was true about you, the wallet was yours, and the photograph was yours. And that was the only thing that needed to be true for the decision to be simple." Jackson looked at him for a long moment. "That's the thing about you, Ethan," he said. "Most people make decisions based on everything they know about a situation. You made it based on the only thing that actually mattered." Ethan thought about Margaret, about the standards she'd held him to, about 43 years of being seen clearly enough that you couldn't pretend to be less than what you were. Someone taught me that, Ethan said. I know, Baga, Jackson said. They shook hands, the same handshake as Friday, communicating the same things that didn't have verbal equivalents. Ethan drove home. He went to the back room and opened the filing cabinet and added to the important drawer a single piece of paper on which he'd written in his mechanic's shorthand the name Lily M. Morgan Housing Initiative, Founding Conversation, Monday. He put the date on it. He closed the drawer. He stood in the back room in the afternoon, quiet, and he thought about the morning it had started. The wallet in the dust, the 10 seconds, the photograph, 30 seconds of decision. 3 weeks of consequence. And now a name on a fund that would send people into courtrooms for homeowners who'd stopped opening their envelopes, who'd been doing the math in the margins for months and being told their arithmetic was wrong, who needed someone to pick up the phone and sound like a neighbor rather than a legal office. He thought about what Sarah Chen had said. I think this one is going to change something. He thought about Gerald Hsu in his workshop, Dennis Farrow with his vindicated math, Raymond Okafor sleeping through the night, the 40-plus Apex modifications that the audit was going to put in the public record, the Arizona AG's office watching, Patricia Yee with a model that finally had a framework, Jackson Morgan with a daughter's name on something that would outlast everything either of them could personally do. He thought about a 25-year-old woman who wanted to be a lawyer and was already formidable and had a laugh that couldn't be faked for a camera. He thought about Margaret's voice saying, "You only get to decide what you owe the world." He walked to the kitchen. He made his evening coffee. He sat at the table in the house that was still his, that had a repaired roof and a functioning faucet and a door that opened properly. And he looked out the window at the desert that had been the whole world of his life. And he felt not happiness, exactly, which was too light a word for what it was. He felt the specific, grounded, unshakable weight of a life that had arrived in his 72nd year at the reason for itself. He had spent 40 years as a mechanic because he believed things that were broken could be fixed if you were honest about what was wrong with them. He had spent 43 years married to Margaret because she was the only person who had ever been as honest with him as he tried to be with everything else. He had spent 3 years alone because that was what losing her required, and he had done it without bitterness because bitterness had never been the kind of fuel he ran on. And then one morning on a stretch of highway outside Flagstaff, he had found a wallet. He had picked it up. He had looked at a photograph of a young woman laughing the way Margaret used to laugh, and he had made the only decision that was consistent with everything he had ever been. And from that decision, from those 30 seconds, from the single distinction between what was his and what wasn't, everything else had followed. Not because the world was fair, which it wasn't, or because good things happened to good people, which they didn't reliably in any way you could count on, but because doing the right thing completely and without expecting return had a way of setting things in motion that the person doing it had no way of predicting or controlling. It moved. It spread. It found the people and the places it needed to reach. It became eventually something larger than the moment it had started in. Because one honest man had crouched down on a highway shoulder at 72 years old and picked up what wasn't his and made sure it got back to the person it belonged to. And that all of it, every consequence and connection and case and name on a fund and workshop visited for the first time in 3 months, that was what an honest life owed the world. And the world this time had paid it back in full.